Before we begin tonight's story, welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. Here, we explore real cases, some solved, some still cloaked in mystery, told in a calm, unhurried way to help you unwind, even as the details linger in your mind. If you find yourself drawn into the stories we share, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, settle in, let your thoughts slow, and let's begin. The air that late October evening in 1998 was sharp with the smell of wood smoke. In the small Pennsylvania township of Redford, autumn had arrived in full. Leaves lay scattered across cracked sidewalks, and the sun dipped early behind the low, forested hills. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where people nodded to each other in passing without having to remember names, and where life moved at the pace of the changing seasons. 17-year-old Sarah Whitmore lived with her parents, Evelyn and Dean, in a modest two-story house at the end of Bridle Path Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac just outside the town centre. Sarah was in her senior year at Redford High, a student who didn't make trouble, who was well-liked without being particularly popular. She was the kind of girl neighbors trusted to watch their kids or feed their pets when they were away, responsible, polite, with a soft voice and a quick, wry smile. On the night she vanished, Sarah had been working her shift at Millie's Diner, a small but well-loved spot where locals went for burgers and bottomless coffee. She had been there for almost a year, saving her wages for college, which she planned to attend in the fall. That Friday, October 23rd, she worked until just after 9 p.m., staying a little later than usual to help the owner wipe down counters after a rush. She clocked out at 9:17 p.m., according to the time card, and stepped out into the cool night air with her denim jacket zipped up to her chin. Her walk home should have been short, a little under a mile along Main Street, turning left at the old post office and then cutting down Bridle Path Lane to her family's home. But somewhere along that short, familiar route, Sarah Whitmore disappeared. When she didn't arrive home by 9:45, her mother wasn't immediately alarmed. Sarah sometimes stopped to talk with friends or lingered to pick up something from the small grocery on Main. But by 10:30, Evelyn's unease had grown into a tight knot in her chest. She tried Sarah's cell phone, but there was no answer. At 11:15, she called the diner. The owner, Millie, confirmed Sarah had left over an hour before and seemed perfectly fine when she walked out the door. By midnight, Dean Whitmore was driving slowly along Sarah's usual route, headlights sweeping over the cracked sidewalks and darkened storefronts. There was no sign of her, no movement, no sound except the whisper of leaves skittering in the road. At 12:43 a.m., the Whitmores called the Redford Township Police Department to report their daughter missing. The first officer arrived within 15 minutes. Officer Mark Ralston knew the family. He had coached Sarah in youth soccer years earlier, and his expression was grave from the moment he stepped inside their home. He listened carefully to the Whitmores' account, jotting notes in a small spiral pad. Missing teenagers were often found within hours, especially in towns like Redford, but Ralston's instincts told him this case was different. By 2 a.m., search efforts began. Officers and a handful of volunteers combed the sidewalks and alleyways, their flashlights cutting pale beams through the darkness. They checked the diner again, the grocery store, the post office. They drove slowly past the wooded edges of Bridle Path Lane, scanning for any sign of movement. Nothing. The next morning, a more formal search began. The Redford police called in the county sheriff's office, and by mid-morning, K9 units were on the ground. The dogs picked up Sarah's scent outside Millie's Diner and followed it along Main Street, as expected. The trail turned left at the post office, but then only a few hundred feet down Bridle Path Lane, the scent abruptly ended. It was as if Sarah had stepped off the face of the earth. The police questioned everyone who might have seen her that night. One witness, a delivery driver making a late-night drop at the grocery store, recalled seeing a girl in a denim jacket walking quickly down Main Street at around 9:20. He said she looked like she was in a hurry, glancing over her shoulder once, but he couldn't be sure it was Sarah. Another resident reported hearing what they described as a sharp cry, sometime after 9:30, near the intersection of Main and Bridle Path Lane. They assumed it was just kids messing around. The Whitmores clung to hope in those early days, but each night that passed without Sarah's return made it harder to believe she would simply walk through the door. Flyers went up around town. Her picture, brown hair, green eyes, the faint trace of a smile, was taped to telephone poles, shop windows, and the diner's front door. The search expanded into the wooded areas beyond Bridle Path Lane, with volunteers in bright orange vests trudging through undergrowth, calling her name. Helicopters swept over the countryside. Every lead, no matter how faint, was followed. But the leads dwindled quickly, replaced by a heavier, quieter dread. By the second week, the police publicly acknowledged that foul play was likely. The Whitmore home, once filled with the easy rhythm of family life, grew silent. Sarah's room remained exactly as she had left it, the bed neatly made, a stack of textbooks on the desk, her jacket missing from the hook by the door. Evelyn spent hours sitting on Sarah's bed, staring at the doorway, as if expecting her to appear. Dean threw himself into work, coming home only to sleep, speaking little, and then on the 14th day after her disappearance, a strange detail emerged. A woman named Carla Benson, who lived on a farmhouse property 3 miles outside town, called the police. She said that on the night Sarah vanished, she had seen an unfamiliar vehicle parked at the edge of the old service road that led into the state forest. It was an older model van, pale blue, with no visible plates. She remembered it because it seemed out of place, sitting there with its lights off. At one point, she thought she saw a shadow moving near the back of the van. Police searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing. No tire tracks, no clothing, no sign of Sarah. The tip went into the growing case file, another fragment of a puzzle that refused to come together. As October slipped into November, the cold settled in. Leaves gave way to bare branches, and the people of Redford grew quieter, more guarded. For years to come, parents would recall how they began keeping their children closer, how the freedom to walk alone after dark evaporated in a single night. Sarah Whitmore had become a ghost story in her own hometown, but the truth was far darker than any whispered tale. And though no one knew it yet, the first real clue to her fate was already in police hands. The first 2 weeks of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had left the town of Redford on edge, but by the 3rd week, the case began to take on a strange, almost unnerving texture. The usual rhythm of missing person investigations seemed to falter. Leads came in sporadically, often too vague or contradictory to act upon. It was as if the night Sarah vanished had been absorbed by some void where details could not survive. Detective Lewis Corbett from the county sheriff's office took over as lead investigator on the case. Corbett was in his late 40s, a quiet man with a reputation for patience, the kind of patience that could sit for hours in silence, waiting for a suspect to say just one wrong thing. He had worked both homicides and missing persons cases before, but this one felt different from the start. Corbett spent his first week reading over every statement and tip that had come in. He retraced Sarah's last known steps, walking from Millie's Diner to the intersection of Main Street and Bridle Path Lane, noting how quickly the streetlights thinned out. Past the post office, shadows gathered thickly between the houses, and by the time he reached Bridle Path Lane, only the pale glow from a few porch lights broke the darkness. It was here in that dim corridor between safety and isolation that the trail seemed to vanish. He spoke again with the delivery driver, who thought he had seen Sarah. The man's story didn't change, but his certainty wavered. "I'm not saying it wasn't her," he told Corbett, rubbing at his jaw. "It's just it was dark, and she was walking fast. Could have been another girl about her height, but the jacket, yeah, it looked like denim." The other witness, the one who heard a cry, gave Corbett little more to work with. "It was quick," the man said, "not like someone screaming bloody murder, more like startled or scared. But I didn't see anything, figured it was nothing." Corbett pressed him for a time frame, but the best he could get was between 9:30 and 10. The most intriguing lead was still the pale blue van spotted by Carla Benson. Corbett drove out to the service road she mentioned. In daylight, The area looked deceptively harmless, a gravel turnoff beside a stretch of quiet country road, leading into a corridor of dense trees. But as soon as he stepped beyond the tree line, the light dimmed, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The service road wound deep into the state forest, narrowing until only one vehicle could pass at a time. Forensics teams had already searched the location, but Corbett brought them back for another pass. They sifted through leaf litter, checked drainage ditches, and examined the soil for signs of disturbance. They found no trace of Sarah, but near the edge of the turnoff, Corbett noticed something odd, a patch of gravel darker than the surrounding area, as if it had been damp recently. When he crouched to look closer, he spotted faint impressions in the gravel, too irregular to be footprints, but not random either. He took photographs, knowing they might be meaningless, yet unwilling to dismiss them. Back in town, Corbett met with Sarah's parents. The Whitmores were exhausted, their faces drawn and pale. Evelyn clutched a mug of untouched coffee, as Dean sat stiffly beside her, his gaze fixed on the wall. Corbett asked about Sarah's habits, her friends, whether she'd mentioned any plans that night. The answers were the same as before. She'd gone to work, she was supposed to come home, she hadn't mentioned anything unusual. When Corbett asked if Sarah had seemed worried or distracted in the days before her disappearance, Evelyn hesitated. She was quieter than usual, she admitted. But I thought it was just school stress. She had a history exam coming up. She never told me anything was wrong. Dean broke his silence then, his voice low but firm. Sarah wasn't the kind of kid to just run off. Someone took her. I don't care what anyone else says. She wouldn't leave without telling us. Corbett believed him. The investigation widened. Detectives interviewed classmates, co-workers, anyone who might have crossed paths with Sarah. A few students recalled she had been avoiding a particular boy at school, a senior named Kyle Harmon. He'd asked her out a few weeks earlier, and she had politely turned him down. Since then, he had been seen lingering near her locker or watching her during lunch. Corbett brought Kyle in for questioning. The boy was lanky, nervous, shifting constantly in his seat. He admitted to liking Sarah, but denied following her. She was nice to me, he said. I thought maybe she just needed time, but I never bothered her. I didn't even see her that Friday. His alibi, that he'd been at a friend's house playing video games all evening, was confirmed by two friends and a parent. For now, Kyle was ruled out. Weeks passed, and the search for Sarah began to lose its urgency in the public eye. News coverage slowed. The flyers around town faded from the weather, their corners curling. But Corbett refused to let the case grow cold. He returned again and again to the detail of the pale blue van. It was an older model, according to Carla Benson, the kind you might see in the 1980s, with boxy edges and a sliding side door. Corbett reached out to surrounding counties, requesting any recent reports of suspicious vans matching that description. A handful of calls trickled in, but none could be tied directly to Sarah's disappearance. Then, just before Christmas, a new piece of information surfaced. A man named Richard Hale, who worked as a night janitor at the high school, called the police with something he'd been reluctant to share. On the night Sarah went missing, he had been driving home around 9:40 p.m. when he saw a pale blue van parked near the intersection of Main and Bridle Path Lane. He didn't think much of it at the time, but now, hearing about the other sighting, he wondered if it was important. What caught his attention, Hale said, was that the van's driver's side door was open, and a man was standing beside it. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. Hale couldn't see his face, but he noticed the man seemed to be looking intently down the road, toward where Sarah would have been walking. Corbett's pulse quickened as he took down the statement. The location matched the point where Sarah's scent had vanished. If the timing was correct, she might have been only minutes away when Hale drove by. The problem was that Hale's description of the man was too vague to build from. Tall, average build, dark jacket, baseball cap, in a small town that fit dozens of men. Still, it confirmed what Corbett had begun to suspect. The van wasn't a coincidence. Winter deepened, Snow blanketed the streets, muffling sound, and Bridle Path Lane seemed even more still than usual. The Whitmores kept a light burning in the window each night. Evelyn said it was for Sarah, so she could see her way home. Dean said little, but every so often, Corbett caught him watching the road outside, as if willing a figure to appear. The investigation remained stubbornly stagnant until late January, when another break came from an unexpected source. A farmer in the next county reported that someone had abandoned a pale blue van on a disused logging trail near his property. It had been there for several days before he called it in, thinking it might be stolen. Deputies were sent to the scene. The van was indeed an older model, its paint faded, the license plates missing. Inside they found little: a stained mattress in the back, an empty soda can, a few cigarette butts. The vehicle identification number had been filed down, but technicians managed to lift partial prints from the interior. The prints didn't match anyone in the Whitmore family, nor any known offenders in state or federal databases. But the discovery of the van renewed hope. Corbett had it towed for further examination, knowing it could be the first tangible link to whoever had taken Sarah. Forensic analysis yielded one more clue: a single strand of hair caught in the edge of the van's sliding door. Under the microscope, it was brown, consistent with Sarah's hair color. DNA testing was ordered, though results would take weeks. As February approached, the case felt as though it was teetering on the edge of a revelation, the kind of moment where all the quiet, patient work of months might finally give way to clarity. But the truth, as Corbett would come to learn, was still hidden in shadows. And some shadows, when you finally step into them, are far darker than you ever imagined. By the first week of February, the pale blue van had become the focal point of the investigation, its ghostly presence seeming to hover over every conversation about Sarah's disappearance. For Detective Lewis Corbett, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a doorway, the most tangible link between the world Sarah had inhabited and the place she had been taken to. The van was stored in the sheriff's secure evidence facility, where forensic technicians worked in shifts, combing over every inch. Corbett visited almost daily, leaning over the hood as if the metal could speak if only he asked the right question. The mattress in the back, though stained and worn, yielded no identifiable blood traces. The soda can bore a partial fingerprint, frustratingly incomplete. The cigarette butts, however, were more promising. DNA was successfully extracted and entered into CODIS, the national database. Days passed. No matches came back. While he waited, Corbett focused on tracking the van's origins. With the VIN filed down, he relied on subtle manufacturing quirks to narrow the make and year. An automotive expert estimated it was a Dodge Ram from the mid to late 1980s. That alone wasn't much help. Thousands of such vans had been made, but the faded paint had an unusual tint, a slightly greenish undertone. That, combined with an aftermarket roof rack, could help narrow the search. Deputies canvassed junkyards, repair shops, and used car lots within a 100-mile radius. It was tedious work, but after a week, they hit on something: a small garage in Elmerton, 40 miles away, where the owner recalled doing minor repairs on a pale blue Dodge van in early autumn. The van's owner had paid cash, asked no questions, and left quickly. The garage owner remembered the man as being in his 40s, tall, with light-colored hair and a voice that was soft but cold. He couldn't recall a name, but he did remember a partial plate number, 6D4. That fragment was enough to whittle down a list of potential owners. One name jumped out: Gerald Jerry Klein, a 46-year-old drifter with a history of minor offenses, trespassing, petty theft, and one charge of unlawful restraint that had been dropped when the victim refused to testify. Klein had no fixed address, drifting between seasonal jobs and cheap motels. He had grown up in Redford before leaving in his 20s, only to drift back every few years. Corbett found an old mugshot. Klein's eyes were pale and hard, his smile crooked, not quite reaching his expression. He fit the general description given by Richard Hale, The night janitor. Corbett began digging into Klein's recent movements, but the man had gone to ground. No current job, no credit card activity, no vehicle registrations. At the same time, the DNA results on the hair from the van came back. It was a match to Sarah Whitmore. The news landed in the Whitmore household like a physical blow. Evelyn sat rigid at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on some point beyond the room. Dean's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked as though he might say something, but no words came. "This doesn't mean she's gone," Corbett told them gently. "It means she was in that van. That's all we know for certain." But he knew they could hear the weight beneath his words. The growing likelihood that Sarah had been taken far from Redford, and that the longer she remained missing, the slimmer the chances of finding her alive. Corbett put out an APB on Klein, and the van's last known movements, though he suspected the man had already abandoned it to avoid detection. In early March, a break came from an unexpected angle. A motel owner in Franklin County, about 60 miles from Redford, called the sheriff's office after seeing Klein's photo on a news segment. She said she recognized him as a guest who had stayed for several nights in late November, just weeks after Sarah vanished. He had checked in alone, but had paid in cash, and requested a ground floor room in the back, far from the street. The owner didn't remember seeing anyone with him, but she did recall that he'd parked an old van behind the building, partially hidden from view. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Corbett drove out to Franklin County. The motel room had long since been cleaned and rented to others, but the owner still had the guest registry, and a copy of the identification Klein had provided. It was a state ID card, issued 2 years earlier, listing a P.O. box in a town Corbett knew well, 2 counties over. That P.O. box led to another clue, a small storage unit rented under Klein's name. When Corbett and the warrant team arrived, they found the unit locked with a heavy padlock. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying a faint smell of mildew. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, alongside old tools, tarps and camping gear. Near the back of the unit was a cardboard box, filled with personal items, mismatched shoes, women's scarves, a cracked wristwatch. Corbett's stomach tightened as he sifted through them. None were definitively linked to Sarah, but several looked like they could belong to young women. One item in particular caught his attention, a spiral-bound notebook with rough sketches of various streets, parks and buildings in Redford and nearby towns. In the margin of one map was a crudely drawn figure of a girl walking down a narrow street, Bridle Path Lane. The discovery shifted the investigation's tone from possibility to certainty. This wasn't chance. Klein had been watching, planning. Corbett felt a chill run down his spine as he considered how many other girls might have been in his sights before Sarah. The search for Klein intensified. Marshals were brought in to assist. Tips came in from across the region, most false leads, some dangerously close to vigilante rumors. One caller swore they'd seen Klein in a bus station in Pittsburgh, but security footage disproved it. Another claimed he'd been spotted hitchhiking on Route 17, but by the time officers arrived, the man was gone. In April, the case took a darker turn. A hiker in a remote section of the state forest stumbled upon what at first appeared to be old camping debris. When he looked closer, he realized it was a shallow grave. Authorities were called, and Corbett arrived as the site was being cordoned off. The grave was small, the earth damp and compact. Forensic teams worked carefully, brushing away soil, until fragments of clothing began to emerge. The first layer revealed a denim jacket, frayed at the cuffs. Corbett's heart sank. It matched the description of Sarah's jacket the night she disappeared. But as they excavated further, it became clear this was not a single burial. Beneath the jacket were other items, a pair of sneakers, a scarf, strands of hair in different colors. The remains, when fully uncovered, belonged to at least 2 individuals, both female. It would take weeks to determine their identities. In the meantime, Corbett couldn't ignore the implication. Sarah might not be alone in whatever fate had befallen her. If Klein was responsible, he had done this before. The find reignited media attention. News trucks once again appeared in Redford, parking outside the sheriff's office and the Whitmore's home. Evelyn stopped answering the door. Dean grew more protective, stepping outside only when necessary. Corbett shielded them from the worst of the coverage, but he knew they were aware. The unspoken acknowledgement that the search might end not with a rescue, but with recovery. Then in late April, another lead surfaced. A gas station clerk in a small town near the Ohio border called in after recognizing Klein's photo from a wanted poster. She said he had been in just 2 days earlier, buying coffee and cigarettes. He'd paid in cash, but she was sure it was him. The pale eyes, the light hair, the slight stoop in his posture. Security footage confirmed her account. Klein was alone, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. He looked leaner than in his mugshot, his face drawn. Corbett studied the tape over and over, noting the way Klein glanced at the door every few seconds, as if expecting someone to come in. It was the first confirmed sighting in months, and it placed him heading west. The search radius shifted toward the border, with state police, marshals and local deputies coordinating roadblocks and patrols. But Klein had lived most of his life drifting. He knew how to disappear. Still, Corbett felt the circle tightening. He believed Klein knew his time was running out, and that in desperation, he might make a mistake. What worried Corbett most was not catching him, but what they might find when they did. Because if Klein had Sarah, and she was still alive, each passing day meant the window to bring her home was closing fast. The sky over Redford was heavy with low clouds the morning Detective Lewis Corbett received the call that would end months of pursuit. It was just after 6 a.m., and the air inside his small office felt stale, like the exhaustion of the case itself had seeped into the walls. He had been reviewing notes from the Franklin County motel lead for what felt like the 100th time when his desk phone rang. "Corbett," he answered, voice thick from a night without sleep. "This is Deputy Marks over in Jefferson Township," came the voice on the other end. "We think we've got him." A man matching Klein's description was spotted behind a disused grain mill off County Road 14. The property's been empty for years. Caller said he saw a van parked there, pale blue. Corbett was on his feet before Marks finished the sentence. He grabbed his coat, his badge, and the worn file folder that had become a constant companion. By the time he reached the sheriff's lot, the rain had started, falling in fine misty sheets that blurred the early light. The drive to Jefferson Township took just under an hour, but every minute stretched long. Corbett's mind turned over the same questions. Would Klein be alone? Would Sarah be there alive? And if not, would he at least find an answer for the Whitmores? The grain mill loomed as a silhouette against the pale sky, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust. The lot surrounding it was overgrown, gravel giving way to mud and weeds. 2 sheriff's cruisers sat parked at a distance, their light bars flashing silently. Deputy Marks met him at the edge of the lot. "We've kept our distance, just in case," he said. "There's a van around back, definitely pale blue, no plates, could be abandoned, but the caller swears he saw a man moving around inside." Corbett's pulse quickened as they circled the building. The van was there, partially obscured by tall grass, and the skeletal remains of a chain-link fence. Even under the grey sky, its faded blue paint was unmistakable. He signaled to the other deputies to hold position while he approached. The van's side door was closed, the windows fogged. He drew closer, rain slicking his hair, heart pounding in his ears. From within, there was a faint sound, movement, but not the restless shifting of someone alone. Corbett rapped on the metal. "Jerry Klein," he called, voice firm. "This is Detective Corbett, with the Redford Sheriff's Office. Step out of the vehicle."
Silence, save for the rain on the roof. Then the van rocked slightly, and the door slid open just enough for a pale, gaunt face to appear. Corlin's eyes were sharp and wary, darting past Corbett to the deputies in the distance. "You're a hard man to find," Corbett said. Corlin's lips curled in a faint, humorless smile. "Maybe I didn't want to be found." "Where is she, Jerry?" Corbett asked. Corlin's gaze lingered on him for a beat too long. Then he stepped out, hands raised. "Search it yourself," he said. The deputies closed in, cuffing him without resistance. Corbett moved to the van's rear doors, pulling them open. Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of gasoline and mildew. A rolled-up sleeping bag lay in the corner, alongside a battered duffel. In the opposite corner, huddled beneath a blanket, was a girl. She was thin, her face pale, eyes wide and blinking against the light. For a heartbeat, Corbett thought his mind was playing a cruel. But then she whispered, hoarse and uncertain, Are you the police?" Relief surged through him so suddenly, it left him dizzy. "Yes," he said, gently. "You're safe now. I'm taking you home." It was Sarah Whitmore. She was fragile, her frame light as he helped her from the van, but she could walk. She clung to the blanket, shivering as deputies wrapped another around her shoulder. Evelyn's face flashed in Corbett's mind, the way her eyes had gone dull with waiting, and he felt something shift inside him. For all the darkness of this case, here was a rare ending that might allow for healing.
Colin was silent as they loaded him into the back of a cruiser. He didn't resist, didn't speak, his pale eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Corbett had seen that look before. A man who knew his freedom was over, but who still held on to whatever secrets lived in the spaces between his words. At the hospital, doctors examined Sarah, noting signs of malnutrition and dehydration, but no immediate life-threatening injuries. She spoke in short bursts, her voice trembling. She told Corbett that Colin had approached her that night on Bridle Path Lane, saying her mother had been in an accident and that he'd been sent to bring her to the hospital. She had followed him, confused and scared, until they reached the van. Once inside, she said, he'd driven for hours before stopping at a remote cabin. He kept her there through the winter, moving her between motels and empty buildings, always watching, always keeping her from windows. He never explained why. He never spoke about letting her go. Corbett listened, taking notes, though some part of him wanted to shut the file right there and let her words fade into something the Whitmores would never have to hear again. But he knew the truth mattered, even when it hurt. When Evelyn and Dean arrived at the hospital, the reunion was quiet, almost fragile. Evelyn knelt by the bed, brushing Sarah's hair from her face, as if afraid the girl might dissolve beneath her touch. Dean stood close, his hand on Sarah's arm, his eyes damp but steady. No words could span the distance between November and now, but the silence was thick with the relief of simply being in the same room. Colin was charged with kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and multiple counts of assault. As investigators dug deeper, they found evidence linking him to the remains in the state forest. One victim was identified as a missing girl from Pennsylvania, the other a woman who had vanished from a nearby county 3 years earlier. The timeline suggested Colin had been predatory for years, perhaps decades, slipping in and out of small towns, leaving grief in his wake. The trial was set for late autumn. Corbett testified, recounting the search, the evidence, and the day they found Sarah. Colin sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable, his eyes occasionally flicking towards Sarah, but never holding. Sarah testified, too, though it took every ounce of courage. Her voice wavered, but she spoke clearly, recounting the night she was taken and the months in captivity. The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words pressing into every listener. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, Colin's fate was sealed, life without the possibility of parole. He showed no reaction as the sentence was read. In the months that followed, Sarah's recovery was slow. She avoided crowded places, startled at sudden noises, and sometimes woke from nightmares she couldn't quite describe. But she also began walking in the park again, this time with her parents, and she returned to school in the fall, determined not to let Colin define the rest of her life. Corbett visited once, at Evelyn's invitation. They sat in the Whitmores' living room, the air scented faintly of cinnamon tea. Sarah thanked him quietly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. He knew she would keep moving forward, one step at a time. The case file remained on Corbett's shelf, its edges worn from months of use. Every so often, he would glance at it, not to dwell on the darkness, but to remember that in rare hard-fought moments, the work did lead someone home. On the first clear evening of spring, Corbett walked down Bridle Path Lane alone. The street was as quiet as it had been the night Sarah vanished, the same cracked pavement, the same sagging fences, but the weight of that night felt lighter now. Somewhere beyond the stillness, a girl was home with her family, and a man who had stolen too much from too many would never walk free again. For the Whitmores, life would never return to the way it was before November. But there was laughter now, and the sound of Sarah's footsteps on the stairs, and a sense that the house, once hollowed out by loss, was slowly filling with light again. And for Corbett, that was enough. The Black Pines disappearance. The town of Black Pines, Oregon, was the kind of place where strangers stood out. With fewer than 2,000 residents, its streets wound through deep evergreen forests, and most locals could recognize a person just by the way they walked. It was a quiet place, the kind people moved to when they were ready to disappear from the noise of bigger cities. But in November 2003, someone vanished from Black Pines in a way that was anything but quiet. Her name was Emily Hartwell, a 27-year-old waitress at the only diner on Main Street. She lived in a small rental cabin on the edge of town, a place tucked between the old timber road and a grove of Douglas firs so tall they seemed to touch the sky. Emily had lived in Black Pines for almost 5 years, having moved there from Portland after a difficult breakup. She was the sort of person who could draw people in without meaning to. Friendly but not overly open, someone who asked about others before talking about herself. The night she vanished began like any other. It was a Tuesday, the dinner rush at the diner had died down by 8 p.m., and the rain outside had turned the pavement slick and black. The few remaining customers nursed their coffee refills while Emily wiped down the counter. Her co-worker, Denise, said Emily had been quieter than usual that evening, glancing toward the window whenever a car passed. Around 8:45, the bell above the door jingled, and a man stepped inside. Denise remembered him because she didn't recognize his face, which was rare in Black Pines. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, rainwater dripping from the brim. He took a seat at the far end of the counter and ordered coffee. Emily poured it without comment, but Denise noticed something in the way her eyes lingered on him, like she was trying to place where she'd seen him before. They didn't speak much, at least not in front of anyone else. Denise took a few orders from the last table in the back, and when she returned to the counter, the man's cup was nearly empty. Emily was leaning in slightly, listening as he spoke quietly. Denise caught only one fragment of the conversation, something about not much time left. By 9:15, the man had paid in cash and left. Emily clocked out 15 minutes later. Denise offered her a ride home, but Emily declined, saying she wanted to stop at the gas station on her way. That was the last time anyone in Black Pines saw her. The next morning, Emily didn't show up for her shift. At first, Denise thought she might be sick, but by mid-afternoon, when no one could reach her, she drove out to Emily's cabin. The door was locked, her car was parked outside, and there was no sign of disturbance. But the strangest thing was that the lights inside were still on. Denise called the sheriff's office. Sheriff Paul Roebuck was a lifelong resident of Black Pines and had seen his share of missing person cases, though most were resolved quickly. Someone visiting family without telling anyone, or a hiker who'd lost track of time in the woods. But Emily's situation was different. She hadn't taken her purse, her phone, or even a jacket, despite the cold November rain. Deputies canvassed the area, questioning neighbors and co-workers. One man living 2 cabins down thought he heard a car on the old timber road around 10 p.m., but he hadn't looked outside. Another neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Keating, recalled hearing a short, sharp cry sometime that night, but she couldn't pinpoint the time and admitted it might have been a fox. By the second day, the Oregon State Police were called in to assist. They brought dogs, who tracked a scent from Emily's cabin along a narrow trail toward the timber road, where it abruptly stopped. Tire impressions were found in the mud, 2 distinct sets, one from a standard sedan, another from a larger vehicle, possibly a truck or van. Sheriff Roebuck thought immediately of the man in the diner. Denise gave a description, and a composite sketch was created. It showed a man in his mid-30s, angular face, deep-set eyes, and a shadow of stubble along his jaw. No one in town recognized him. The gas station clerk said Emily never came by that night. Security footage from the station, grainy and distorted by the rain, showed only a few customers between 9 and 10 p.m., none of them matching her description. For days, search teams combed the forests around Black Pines. Helicopters flew overhead, their blades echoing against the trees, while volunteers walked in tight grids through the underbrush. But the rain had washed away much of the physical evidence, and the woods seemed to swallow sound and movement whole. The case took on an unsettling edge, when deputies found something at the edge of the timber road, about a mile from Emily's cabin. It was a scarf, pale blue, with a faint floral pattern. Denise identified it immediately as Emily's. It was damp and slightly torn, caught on the low branch of a cedar tree. Beneath it, half buried in mud, was a coffee cup, the kind used at the diner. The discovery deepened the mystery. Was Emily taken from her home, or had she left willingly with someone, only for it to turn? The last confirmed sighting of her was with the man in the diner, but no one could identify him, and no vehicle matching the tire tracks had been spotted in town before. In the weeks that followed, tips came in from across Oregon. A woman in Grants Pass claimed she saw someone resembling Emily at a rest stop off I-5, but surveillance footage disproved it. Another lead came from a logging camp 2 counties over, where a worker reported seeing a pale blue scarf tied to a fence post. Deputies investigated, but the scarf was newer, still with a store tag attached. By December, the case was stalling. The snow began to fall, covering the ground in a silent white layer that made further searches nearly impossible. Emily's family, who lived in Portland, held a candlelight vigil in the town square. Dozens of people turned out, their faces lit by the flickering flames, the cold air thick with unsaid fears. For Sheriff Roebuck, the unanswered questions kept him awake at night. Why had Emily been so quiet that evening at the diner? What did the man say to her that made her lean in to listen? And what did he mean by not much time left? The answers, he knew, might be buried somewhere out in the dark expanse of the Black Pines forest, if only they could find them before the trail went cold forever. The cold deepened as December crept toward the new year, the forest around Black Pines heavy with snow and silence. For Sheriff Roebuck, the stillness wasn't comforting, it felt like something was holding its breath. The search for Emily Hartwell had been officially scaled back, but for him there was no such thing as closing the book. He carried her file everywhere, a constant reminder that someone in his town knew more than they were saying. The diner had become quieter too. Denise still worked her shifts, but she admitted to friends that every time the bell above the door jingled, she half expected that same tall stranger to walk in again. She replayed the night of Emily's disappearance in her head, over and over, trying to catch some details she'd missed. The way Emily stood, the words she might have whispered back, the tone in her voice. But the harder she tried, the more the memory seemed to blur, like the snow erasing tire tracks on a road. The man from the diner had become the central figure in the investigation, a ghost in a baseball cap. The composite sketch was tacked up at the post office, the grocery store, even in the window of the diner itself. Calls came in from people who swore they'd seen him, but each lead fizzled. One tip sent deputies to a cabin outside Klamath Falls, only to find an elderly man who had been there for years. Another pointed toward a drifter in Coos Bay, but he was ruled out by an airtight alibi. Then on January 3rd, something shifted. A logger named Frank Torres walked into the sheriff's office, carrying a weathered leather glove. He said he'd found it wedged under a root ball near one of the service trails that cut through the northern stretch of Black Pines Forest. What caught his attention was that the glove was stiff with what looked like dried mud, and faintly maybe blood. Deputies went out to the spot with Frank leading the way. The snow was deep, and their boots sank into it with each step, but when they reached the place he'd described, they found something else. Half hidden beneath the root ball, just beyond where the glove had been, was an old cigarette lighter, scratched and dented. Denise later confirmed that Emily had carried a lighter just like it. Even though she didn't smoke, she kept it for lighting candles at home. The find rekindled the search. Investigators began to focus on that section of the forest, a rugged area where old timber roads branched off in confusing patterns. The tire tracks found weeks earlier had never been conclusively matched to a specific vehicle, but this location was less than a mile from where the scent trail had ended. A volunteer named Greg, who'd lived in Black Pines most of his life, told Sheriff Roebuck something interesting during the renewed search. Back in the late 90s, before Emily had even moved to town, the Northern Timber Road had been used by hunters and off-road enthusiasts. But there had also been talk, never confirmed, of it being a spot where people went to meet in secret, away from prying eyes. Greg remembered finding a rusted-out van there once, abandoned and stripped bare. The sheriff filed that away, not sure if it meant anything yet. Meanwhile, Emily's family had hired a private investigator named Carla Dean. Carla was a former Portland police detective, sharp-eyed and blunt, with a knack for getting people to talk. She began by interviewing everyone at the diner again, even those who'd already spoken to the sheriff's office. Her method was simple: ask about the small things, the kind people don't think to mention. From Denise she learned that the man in the diner had paid in cash but used a folded bill from inside a money clip. Carla thought that was worth noting. Not everyone still used money clips, and it suggested a certain attention to detail, maybe even old-fashioned habits. From one of the regulars, she learned that when the man spoke to Emily, his voice had been low and measured, without any noticeable accent, but his eyes kept flicking toward the window as though he was waiting for someone. Carla also did something the sheriff hadn't. She traced Emily's old life back in Portland, looking for any loose ends. She learned that before moving to Black Pines, Emily had briefly dated a man named Daniel Kerr, who'd been arrested twice for assault during bar fights. He had a temper, and according to mutual acquaintances, he'd taken Emily's decision to leave the city hard. Daniel claimed he hadn't spoken to her in years, and cell records put him in Washington state the night she vanished. Still, Carla kept him on her list. One evening while Carla was at the diner, a local named Jake Harper approached her. He was in his late 40s, soft-spoken, and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He told her that 2 nights after Emily disappeared, he'd been driving home from a late shift at the mill when he saw headlights on the old timber road, not near the entrance, but deep inside, where there were no houses. The lights had been stationary, and as he passed, he thought he saw 2 figures standing outside a vehicle. He hadn't told anyone, because he assumed it was just hunters or kids drinking in the woods. Carla took that to Sheriff Roebuck immediately. The problem was, heavy snow and weeks of time had erased any physical trace from that stretch of road. But it gave them a possible timeline, and more importantly, a sense that Emily's disappearance might not have been an immediate snatch and run. In mid-January, something else happened that rattled the town. A fisherman walking along the icy banks of Pine Hollow Creek, about 6 miles from Emily's cabin, found a single sneaker lodged between 2 rocks in the shallow water. It was soaked, but the brand and size matched shoes Emily was known to wear. Forensics confirmed later that it was hers. The creek's current was slow that time of year, which meant the sneaker probably hadn't traveled far. Search teams scoured the area, but again the snow and ice worked against them. No other items were recovered. The case was becoming a tangle of threads. The mysterious man, the glove and lighter, the sighting of headlights, the creek, each piece suggested something, but nothing tied it neatly together. By late January,
Sheriff Roebuck and Carla began considering that Emily might have known her abductor. It would explain why she didn't seem alarmed at the diner, why she left without telling Denise where she was really going, and why there was no sign of forced entry at her cabin. If that was true, then either the man in the diner was someone she recognized despite the cap and low brim, or he was acting on behalf of someone she knew. Carla dug into phone records from the weeks leading up to Emily's disappearance. Most of the calls were ordinary, work contacts, her family, a few friends. But there were 2 short calls to an unfamiliar prepaid number, just 3 days before she went missing. The calls lasted less than a minute each. The number, when traced, had been purchased in cash at a small electronics store in Eugene, and was never used again after the night of Emily's disappearance. Sheriff Roebuck stared at that detail for a long time. A prepaid phone used for exactly 2 calls to Emily, then discarded. It felt deliberate, calculated. Someone had reached out to her, and whatever they said had been important enough for her to leave her cabin late at night in the rain. By February, the public's attention was waning, as it often does when answers are slow to come. But in Black Pines, the tension lingered. People kept their doors locked more than before. Parents told their teenagers not to walk alone after dark. And in the diner, Denise noticed that even regular customers seemed quieter, as though speaking too loudly might draw the wrong kind of notice. Then came an unexpected development. Carla received a voicemail from a blocked number. The voice was male, low and calm. It said only, "You're looking in the wrong part of the forest." The message was traced, but as expected, it led to another prepaid phone, purchased in cash in a town 3 hours away. It had been activated for only 1 day. For Carla, the call was both a threat and a clue. Someone was watching the investigation closely enough to know where search efforts had been concentrated. And whoever it was, they wanted to steer them elsewhere, or away from something. In early March, the snow began to melt. The forest floor, long buried, started to show its winter secrets. And as the thaw revealed the earth beneath, searchers found something that would change the course of the investigation. It wasn't Emily. Not yet. But it was the first undeniable sign of where she had been. The March thaw crept slowly into Black Pines, but when it came, it was almost violent in its transformation. The snow, which had lain heavy and unmoving for months, began to slump away in wet sheets. Meltwater trickled through the gullies and along the forest roads, carrying pine needles, bits of bark, and the remnants of the winter's secrecy into the streams. The day the searchers found the new clue, it was only 43 degrees, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and thawing moss. Sheriff Roebuck had been in his office, going over reports that felt more like echoes than leads, when Deputy Hall radioed in from the northern sector. His voice was tense but steady. "Sheriff, we've got something you need to see. Now." Roebuck drove out himself, the old county SUV skidding a little on the muddy track. The location was less than a mile from where Frank Torres had found the glove back in January, a low-lying patch where runoff had carved shallow channels through the forest floor. Hall and 2 volunteers were standing beside a half-collapsed mound of leaves and sticks. One of them, a former game warden named Wes, was holding something in a clear evidence bag. It was a scarf. At first glance, it looked like any knitted winter scarf, frayed at one end from wear. But the pattern, a pale blue with a white chevron stripe, was one Denise remembered clearly. Emily had worn it almost every day that winter. Denise even recalled joking once that Emily must sleep in it. The scarf was damp, the fibers clotted with mud and pine needles, but it was unmistakably hers. And just like the sneaker, it was far from her cabin, but within the general orbit of that northern timber road. They swept the area methodically. Roebuck walked the perimeter himself, eyes on the ground, boots sinking slightly into the thaw-softened soil. The scent of rot was faint but present. Not the overwhelming odor of decomposition, but something organic breaking down. It could have been anything in a forest: a deer carcass, wet leaves, a raccoon buried by snow. Still, it made him uneasy. The forensics team flagged several disturbed patches of soil, each roughly rectangular. In the frozen months they might have gone unnoticed, but now, with the snow melting, they were more visible, soft depressions, where the ground had settled differently than the surrounding forest floor. They probed one of the sites gently with a thin metal rod. The rod came back clean, and the sheriff told them to hold off digging until the ground dried a bit more. Whatever had been buried there might be fragile, and the last thing they could afford was damaging potential evidence. Carla Dean arrived an hour later, her hair pulled back, boots caked with mud from the hike-in. She studied the scarf without saying a word at first, just turning it over in her gloved hands. Then she looked at Roebuck. If this was here all winter, it's because someone wanted it to be. We've had searchers and dogs through this sector twice before, which means it was either buried under enough snow to hide it, or it was placed here later. The sheriff considered that. If it had been planted after the fact, then the person responsible had been confident enough to return to the scene, knowing the investigation was active. That wasn't recklessness. That was a calculated move. A way to remind them that he was still out there, still in control. That night, as the town's streetlights flickered through a light drizzle, Carla went over the map of known search areas in her motel room. She circled the places where items had been found. The glove, the lighter, the sneaker, the scarf. The spacing wasn't random. They roughly formed a crooked arc, all within a few miles of each other, but each discovery was just far enough apart to force the search outward. It was like someone was breadcrumbing them, but not toward an endpoint, rather in a loop. The next morning, Roebuck received another anonymous voicemail. The voice was the same as before. Male, calm, deliberate. "You're still looking in the wrong place," it said again, but this time added, "Think about what she came here for." It was an odd phrasing. What she came here for. Implied purpose, as though Emily's move to Black Pines hadn't been purely for the quiet life she'd claimed to want. Carla replayed the message several times, trying to catch any background noise, a hum, a distant sound, but it was clean, too clean. She decided to dig deeper into Emily's activities during her months in Black Pines. Denise was able to tell her about Emily's routines, the morning walks, the hours she spent reading, the occasional trips into town for groceries or the hardware store. But one detail stood out. Emily had made several trips to a small independent print shop in Crescent Falls, the next town over. Denise had asked once what she was having printed, and Emily had said something about records, and just sorting through old stuff. Carla drove to the print shop, and spoke with the owner, a wiry man in his 60s named Earl. At first he said he couldn't remember anything unusual, until she showed him a photo of Emily. Then his face changed. "Yeah, I remember her. Came in maybe 4 or 5 times. Always had a little USB stick. She'd print out documents, sometimes photos. Paid in cash. I didn't read any of it. Not my business. But I did notice she was real particular about the paper she wanted. Heavy stock, like for archival stuff." When Carla asked if he still had the print logs from those months, Earl shook his head. The shop's system only kept them for 30 days. Whatever Emily had been working on, the paper trail was gone. Meanwhile, Roebuck decided to re-interview Jake Harper, the mill worker who'd seen the headlights deep on the timber road. This time Jake was more forthcoming. He admitted that the stationary lights had been near an old hunter's shack, a structure that had fallen into disuse years ago, but still had 4 walls and a roof. Roebuck knew the place. It was marked on some maps but not all. In winter the road to it was usually impassable. They arranged a team to check the shack as soon as the weather allowed. The drive-in was rough, mud sucking at the tires, branches scraping the sides of the vehicles, but they reached it by mid-afternoon. The shack was little more than a wooden box, leaning to one side, with gaps in the planks wide enough for snow to blow through. Inside, the floor was littered with old cans, scraps of cloth, and animal droppings, but in the far corner, partially hidden under a rotted tarp, was a sleeping bag. It wasn't new, but it wasn't as weather-worn as everything else in the shack. Near it, a small metal tin contained a few matches and a cigarette butt. The butt was bagged for testing, though Roebuck doubted they'd get much from it after months in the damp. Still, the presence of the sleeping bag meant someone had been there recently, possibly during the very period when Jake saw those headlights. Back in town, whispers started again. The shack became another focal point for speculation. Some believed it had been a holding place, where Emily was kept before being moved. Others thought it was just a waypoint, a place for her abductor to rest or stash supplies. But for Carla, the question was why the abductor would take such risks. Returning to the scene to plant evidence, using a shack within known territory, leaving traces that could be found. Either this person was overconfident, or they were playing a game. In late March, heavy rains swept through the region, threatening to wash away what little evidence the thaw had revealed. Roebuck pushed his team to cover as much ground as possible, before the forest reset itself again. Then, just when it seemed the trail was fading once more, a hiker found something at the base of a cedar tree near the creek. It was a small leather-bound notebook, its cover warped from moisture. Inside, most of the pages were blank, except for a few, written in Emily's handwriting. The entries were short, dated sporadically in the weeks before she disappeared. Some were mundane: cold morning, snow falling again, or Denise made pie, best I've had in years. But others were more cryptic. Met him again, says he has what I've been looking for, and later, he wants to meet in the North Woods. Says it's safer there. Carla stared at those lines for a long time. Whatever Emily had been searching for, it was enough to draw her out into the forest at night. Enough to make her trust someone she shouldn't have. And now, the final entry, dated 2 days before she vanished, read simply, "If he's telling the truth, this could change everything." The edges of the mystery were starting to sharpen, but the heart of it remained hidden, just beyond reach. And in Black Pines, as April approached, so did the sense that time was running out to bring Emily home. By the first week of April, the mountains surrounding Black Pines had shed their snowcaps entirely, leaving dark, slick slopes glistening in the weak sun. The creeks ran high and fast with meltwater, and the forest floor, now free from its icy shroud, was a carpet of wet pine needles and slick roots. For investigators, this was both a blessing and a curse. The thaw revealed what winter had hidden, but it also erased tracks, diluted scents, and carried away the fragile traces of human presence. Sheriff Roebuck sat at his desk, staring at the notebook that had been found by the cedar tree. The last page, with its cryptic "this could change everything," weighed heavier on him than anything else they'd recovered. He had read it over a dozen times, trying to fit it into the puzzle of Emily Hartwell's life, and every time it seemed to point in a different direction. Carla Dean sat across from him, her fingers resting on a manila folder filled with photographs of the evidence. So far the glove, the lighter, the sneaker, the scarf, the sleeping bag in the shack, and now, the notebook. Spread out together, they looked almost like items from a scavenger hunt, but one where the stakes were someone's life. "We've been assuming the scarf and the glove were dropped or planted after the fact," Carla said quietly. "But what if some of this was left by Emily herself?" Roebuck frowned. "You're saying she knew she was in trouble. I'm saying she might have been trying to leave a trail. If she was meeting someone out in those woods, someone she trusted enough to follow, and that trust went sideways, maybe she started marking her path." It was an unsettling thought, mostly because it meant Emily had likely realized her danger too late. The more they looked at the timeline, the more it seemed that whatever Emily had been looking for had taken root long before her disappearance. The trips to the print shop, the notes about meeting him again, the fact that she'd come to Black Pines alone, with few ties, and no family close enough to check in regularly. Denise, when told about the notebook, was visibly shaken. She remembered Emily mentioning once that she'd grown up believing parts of her childhood story weren't true, that there were unanswered questions about where she came from. She said something about finding proof someday. Denise told them, "I thought she meant like old family records, genealogy stuff. I didn't think." Her voice broke, and she left the sentence unfinished. That night, Carla drove out to the northern timber road alone. The shack was still taped off, the mud around it churned by searchers' boots. She walked past it, following a faint deer path that wound uphill. The air was damp, rich with the smell of rain-soaked earth. She moved slowly, letting her eyes sweep over the ground, the branches, the tree trunks. It was just before dusk when she saw it, a small scrap of fabric caught in the fork of a sapling, about 5 feet off the ground.
You!
It was too weathered to match the scarf, but the color was close, pale blue, frayed at the edges. She bagged it carefully, though she doubted it would yield much. Still, its position suggested wind or weather hadn't placed it there. It was too high, too deliberately snagged. When she returned to the station, Roebuck was waiting with news.
You!
The cigarette butt from the shack had come back from the lab. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in state or federal databases, but there was a partial match in a county file.
You!
A man named Thomas Keene, arrested 6 years earlier for trespassing on private logging land. Keene was a drifter by all accounts, moving between seasonal jobs, and never staying anywhere long. He had a history of minor offenses, petty theft, illegal camping, loitering, but nothing violent on record. Still, Roebuck knew better than to take that as proof of innocence. Some of the most dangerous men in his career had spotless criminal records, until the moment they were caught. They tracked Keene to a trailer on the edge of Crescent Falls. When they arrived, it was empty, the door hanging half open. Inside, the air smelled of stale cigarettes and mildew. There was little in the way of furniture, a cot, a table, a few crates. In one of the crates, they found a folded map of the Black Pines region. Several areas had been circled in red ink, including the shack and the creek where the notebook was found. In the corner of the map, in cramped handwriting, was a note, "Meet 7:30, North Woods." The date next to it matched the night Emily vanished.
The search for Keene became urgent. Flyers went up in Crescent Falls and the surrounding towns. Tips trickled in, most of them dead ends. A man matching his description had been seen hitchhiking on Route 17. Another sighting placed him near the county line, but every time they followed the trail, it ended in nothing. While the manhunt continued, Carla kept circling back to Emily's motive for being out there in the first place. If she'd been looking for answers about her past, and Keene had claimed to have them, then perhaps this wasn't random. Perhaps Emily's abduction, if that's what it was, had been the end point of something she'd set in motion herself. 2 weeks after the map was found, a break came unexpectedly. A farmer in the neighboring county called in, saying he'd found an old duffel bag in the back corner of one of his sheds. He thought it might belong to one of his farmhands, until he opened it. Inside were women's clothes, all about Emily's size. One sweater had her initials stitched into the collar. The farmer said he hadn't been in that shed since before the snow came. Whoever had placed the bag there had done so sometime during the winter. He didn't know Keene personally, but admitted that a man matching his description had done odd jobs for a neighbor last fall. The bag was sent for processing. In a side pocket, they found a small flash drive. Forensics managed to pull the contents, scanned documents, old photographs, and a handful of newspaper clippings. The documents appeared to be adoption records from the early 1980s, though some were incomplete or blacked out. The photographs showed a young girl with strikingly similar features to Emily, though taken decades earlier. The clippings were about missing children cases from that era. It was Denise, when shown the materials, who connected the dots. Emily had once told her she'd been adopted as an infant, but her adoptive parents had passed away years ago, leaving her with few details about her birth family. The girl in the photographs might have been her biological sister, or even herself, though the dates suggested otherwise. The picture that emerged was unsettling. Emily had been trying to trace her origins, and Keane had positioned himself as someone who could help. Whether he had real information or was exploiting her curiosity, he had drawn her out into the woods and away from safety. In mid-April, they finally found him. Keane was spotted sleeping under a bridge outside of Masonville, gaunt and unshaven, wearing the same jacket from his arrest photo years earlier. When deputies approached, he didn't run. At the station, Keane was calm but evasive. He admitted to meeting Emily a few times and claimed she'd come willingly each time. He said she'd asked him about old records and that he'd shown her some places she might find them. He denied harming her, insisting the last time he saw her, she was alive and heading toward the creek to meet another guy. When pressed, he wouldn't name the other man. He claimed not to know, saying only, "She didn't trust me with that." Without a body, without direct evidence tying him to her disappearance, they couldn't hold Keane for long, but Roebuck was convinced he knew more than he was saying. The case, officially, remained open. In the months that followed, searches continued in the northern woods. Every so often, another fragment would surface. A hair clip, a torn page from a book Denise recognized from Emily's cabin, but never enough to answer the central question of where she was, or whether she was still alive. For Denise, the not knowing was its own kind of cruelty. She kept Emily's cabin just as she'd left it. The scarf Denise had been given back folded neatly by the door. Sometimes she would walk the same paths they'd walked together, pausing at the creek, listening to the water rush past, wondering if Emily had stood there too, alone and frightened. Carla left Black Pines in early summer, but the case never left her. The map, the notebook, the flash drive, they all sat in her mind like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. She knew that somewhere in those forests was the truth, buried beneath moss and thyme, waiting for the day it could no longer be hidden. And in Black Pines, the locals learned to live with the shadow of that absence, the unanswered echo of Emily Hartwell's name drifting through the trees whenever the wind turned cold. The cold harvest. The town of Grayford, Illinois, was the kind of place that made no promises. It sat between cornfields and freight lines, its main street still lined with century-old brick buildings whose faded signs hinted at better days. People here learned early that fortunes rose and fell with the harvest, and that if you wanted something to last, you had to keep your head down and your business quiet. It was late October 1997 when the quiet broke. The first frost had already settled in, silvering the stubble in the fields and turning the air sharp enough to sting your lungs. On the morning of October 23rd, a man named Gerald McCoy drove his battered pickup along County Road 9 toward his farm. The sun was just cresting over the horizon when he spotted something odd at the edge of the ditch, a pale shape in the brown grass. At first he thought it was a deer, struck by one of the grain trucks that used the road during harvest season. But as he slowed the truck and leaned over the wheel, he saw the shape wasn't fur but cloth. Gerald stopped, climbed out and walked toward it. It was a woman. She lay on her side, knees drawn up, her hair tangled and wet with frost. She wore a blue sweater and jeans, and her shoes were gone. Her skin was waxy, almost translucent, and her lips were tinged a deep, unnatural blue. Gerald knelt beside her and touched her arm. It was cold and stiff. She had been there for hours, maybe all night. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, word had already spread through the CB radios and the small-town telephone grapevine. Someone's cousin had seen the ambulance on County Road 9. Someone else claimed they knew the woman, and within the hour, people were lingering on porches, scanning for any scrap of news. Sheriff Bill Travers had seen his share of accidents and the occasional violent crime in Grayford's jurisdiction, but this was different. The woman was young, maybe in her mid-20s, and there were no immediate signs of a car crash or a fall. Her hands were scraped, as though she'd crawled, and there was a thin red mark around her left wrist, half hidden beneath the cuff of her sweater. There was no identification on her, no purse, no wallet, nothing in her pockets but a crumpled cigarette pack and a folded sheet of lined notebook paper, damp from the frost. The writing on it was faint, smeared in places, but the words were clear enough. He knows. The body was taken to the county coroner's office in Mason, 20 miles away. By early afternoon, Travers had a name. Her name was Claire Benton. She'd grown up in Mason, graduated high school in 1990, and left for a few years before returning in 95. She worked part-time at the grain elevator, and sometimes waitressed at a diner off the interstate. People who knew her described her as friendly but private, the kind of person you could share a shift with without learning much about her life. But there were whispers too, that she'd been mixed up with a man who was no good, that she had debts, that she was planning to leave town again. No one could say for certain, and most of what reached Travers' ears sounded more like gossip than fact. When the autopsy came back, the results didn't make things any clearer. Claire had died of hypothermia, likely in the early hours of the morning, but there were bruises on her upper arms, shallow abrasions on her knees and palms, and the faint ligature mark on her wrist. She hadn't simply wandered into the ditch and fallen asleep. Something, or someone, had put her there. Travers drove to Mason to speak with her older sister Ellen. She lived in a small house on the south side, the kind where the porch light had a burnt-out bulb and the yard was littered with wind-blown leaves. She was scared, Ellen said, after leading him to the kitchen. Her voice was flat, the way it gets when grief is still too new to fully take hold. She wouldn't tell me of what, not exactly. But last week she asked if she could stay here for a few nights. Said someone had been hanging around her place. Did she say who? Travers asked. No, just that he wouldn't leave her alone. I thought she meant an old boyfriend. She'd had a few, you know, the kind that don't take a hint. Ellen's eyes flicked toward the window, where the light was fading into the long, early evening. She told me she'd taken care of it. I didn't press her. Back in Grayford, Travers started piecing together Claire's last day. On October 22nd, she'd worked the morning shift at the elevator. She left around 1 p.m., stopped by her apartment briefly, then drove out toward the east side of town. Witnesses placed her at a small gas station around 2:30, buying cigarettes and a cup of coffee. After that she seemed to vanish. Her car, a faded green Oldsmobile, was found 2 days later on a dirt road outside of town, its driver's side door unlocked. There was no damage, no sign of a struggle, but the keys were missing. Inside, deputies found another scrap of notebook paper, folded neatly and tucked between the seats. On it was written, "Don't tell him yet." The handwriting matched the first note. Travers kept the papers on his desk, side by side, for days. He knows. Don't tell him yet. He turned the words over in his mind, trying to fit them into some narrative that made sense. They seemed like fragments of a conversation, or perhaps warnings written in haste. The break came unexpectedly, from a man named Larry Phelps. He was a long-haul trucker, who sometimes stopped at the diner where Claire waitressed. He told Travers he'd seen her 2 nights before she died, sitting in a booth with a man he didn't recognize. Tall guy, maybe mid-30s, Phelps said. Dark hair, beard. He kept leaning in real close when he talked. And she looked, I don't know, uncomfortable, like she was trying to smile but couldn't pull it off. Travers asked if he'd overheard any of their conversation. Phelps hesitated. Not much. Just him saying something about the shipment and her saying she wasn't going to do it. He didn't like that. Got real quiet after that. But the look he gave her, he broke off, shaking his head. Not the kind of look you forget. It was a lead but a thin one. No one at the diner that night seemed to know the man, and no one recalled seeing him in Grayford before or after. In the weeks that followed, Travers worked the case as best he could, but leads dried up. The fall harvest ended, snow began to fall, and the town slipped back into its routines, though the shadow of Claire Benton's death lingered. People locked their doors earlier. Parents told their daughters not to drive alone at night. But in quiet moments, in the spaces between other responsibilities, Travers would find himself staring at those 2 scraps of paper. He knows. Don't tell him yet. It was as though Claire had been living inside a story no one else knew, and in her final hours, she'd tried to leave a trail that ended in a frozen ditch by the side of the road, and somewhere out there was the man who had walked the last part of it with her. The frost that had first settled on the fields in late October deepened into ice as November came. Grayford had its first hard snow on the 12th, dusting the corn stubble with a brittle white that cracked underfoot. For Sheriff Bill Travers, the change in weather only added to the sense of urgency. The leaves, long since fallen, left nothing to obscure the terrain, making every farm lane, every ditch, every abandoned patch of brush painfully visible. Yet visibility did not make the work any easier. Claire Benton's case remained cold in the sense that there were no new witnesses, no confessions, and no clear motive. The fragments of evidence, the notes, the bruises, the fleeting sighting at the diner, were all Travers had. And in small towns, whispers and conjecture often did as much harm as good. They could cloud facts and mislead even the most diligent investigators. He started revisiting the places Claire had frequented, retracing her final day as meticulously as possible. The elevator where she worked was a low, brick building at the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of grain dust and old oil, and the conveyor belts clanked with the rhythm of harvest season. He spoke again with the elevator workers, all men and women who knew Claire by name, knew her as the quiet girl who counted kernels and stacked bags with a precision almost obsessive. She didn't talk much, said Hank Morton, a burly man in his 50s, but she listened. You know, really listened. If something was wrong, she'd notice. That's why it hit us so hard when we heard. Travers nodded. Did she ever mention anyone causing her trouble? Someone following her, threatening her? Hank shook his head. No, not openly. But she had a look on her face sometimes, the last week or two, like she was scared of something, but didn't want to say it. I asked if everything was okay. She said it was. But, I don't know. Something was off. From the elevator, Travers went to the diner. It was a small, worn establishment on the edge of the interstate, its neon sign flickering in the dark. He ordered a coffee, and sat at a booth that Claire had occupied countless times. The waitress who now worked there, a woman named Debbie, remembered Claire clearly. She didn't get a lot of customers, Debbie said, her hands folded on the table, but the ones she did get, she treated them like they mattered. I never saw her argue with anyone. She smiled, even when she didn't feel like it. But her eyes told the story. They were worried, scared. Debbie remembered the night Larry Phelps had mentioned, Claire sitting with the man who unnerved her. She didn't know his name, but she recalled a vague sense of menace in his posture, the way he leaned over the table, speaking quietly, making Claire shift uncomfortably in her seat. She remembered the way Claire glanced at the door every few minutes, as if waiting for someone to appear, as if expecting danger to walk in at any moment. Travers left the diner with more questions than answers. The man in the booth was still a phantom, and despite canvassing the area, no one else seemed to have noticed him. If he existed, he was either careful or terrifyingly ordinary, blending into Grayford's routines with unnerving ease. That evening, Travers returned to his office, and spread out the materials he had. The 2 notes, the photographs of Claire's body, statements from witnesses, and his own handwritten observations. The notes continued to haunt him. He knows. Don't tell him yet. He reread them, over and over. The simplicity of the words belied the complexity of what they suggested. They hinted at fear, secrecy, and a man who had power over Claire's final decisions. He began creating a timeline, marking every known sighting and event from October 22nd. Morning shift at the elevator, stop at her apartment, purchase at the gas station, final glimpse at the diner, then silence, until her body was found. Travers plotted the locations on a map of Grayford, noting the roads, farm lanes and fields. The ditch where she had been discovered was on a minor back road, rarely traveled except by locals or harvest crews. Whoever had left her there knew the terrain, knew the routines, and likely knew she would not be found until daylight. The sheriff enlisted the help of the county crime lab to re-examine the body and the notes. Though Claire had been dead for over a week, forensic technicians hoped to find trace evidence, fibers, hair, or other microscopic clues that could identify the perpetrator. Even the faintest print could break the case open. One technician, a young woman named Lisa Chen, called Travers late one evening. "Sheriff, you need to see this," she said. Her voice was steady, but carried a weight of urgency. "We found something on the second note. You remember the one that said, 'Don't tell him yet'? There's a partial fingerprint in the corner. It's smudged, but I think we can lift it. And there's something else, faint traces of a chemical, like industrial cleaner, on the edge of the paper. Someone handled this carefully, probably trying to destroy evidence." Travers felt the familiar jolt of hope that came whenever tangible evidence emerged. "Keep me updated, Lisa. Whatever you need, I'll make sure you get it." While the fingerprint was analyzed, Travers returned to the field where Claire had been found. Snow had settled heavily over the ditch, transforming the landscape into a monochrome of white and gray. He walked slowly along the edges, imagining the night she must have spent there, alone, struggling against cold and fear. He traced her steps, as far as he could reconstruct them, from the last point she was seen to where she ultimately lay. The ground offered no clues now, only the silent, frozen testimony of winter. In the small hours, Travers sat in his patrol car, staring at the windshield, thinking about Claire's final hours. What had she feared? Who was the man she mentioned? And why had she chosen those particular words in her notes? Words that suggested more than fear, that hinted at control, manipulation, and a silent threat that extended beyond her life. The fingerprint results came 2 days later. They were partial, but a match was made. The print belonged to a man named Douglas Crane, a truck driver, with a history of harassment and a minor criminal record, mostly petty thefts and disturbing calls. He had lived in Grayford for several years, but traveled frequently for work. There was no record of violent crimes, at least none that had been proven, but the match gave Travers a direction, a possibility to chase. A team was assembled to bring Crane in. They found him at a small motel on the outskirts of town, sitting in the dim glow of a television, drinking a cold cup of coffee. He was startled, but did not resist when deputies approached. Travers rid him his rights and watched carefully, noting his reactions. Crane's face was impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as he set down the cup. During questioning, Crane denied any involvement. He claimed he had never seen Claire Benton. He said he had been working long hauls during the days in question, miles away from Grayford, but inconsistencies began to emerge. Travel logs did not always match his story, and witnesses recalled seeing a man resembling him in town. The partial fingerprint on the note suggested he had at least touched the paper, and his nervous demeanor betrayed an awareness of more than he admitted. Travers realized the investigation was shifting. What had once been a cold case, a tragedy buried beneath the routine of a small town, was now active. The challenge was piecing together the final hours, understanding who Claire had feared, and why. The notes, the sightings and Crane's evasions began to form a pattern, suggesting that the danger she had sensed was real, immediate, and deliberate. Late one night, Travers returned to the Benton family home. Ellen Benton had spent the day sorting through Claire's possessions, keeping some, discarding others, and trying to preserve a memory that felt fleeting. Travers entered quietly, not wanting to intrude, and found Ellen sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the frost-covered window. She deserved better, Ellen said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She was smart, careful, but she couldn't see what was coming. Travers nodded. "We're close. We have leads now. We'll find out what happened to her, Ellen. I promise you." She gave him a faint, tired smile. "I hope you're right. I don't want anyone else to go through this." Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Snow continued to fall in soft, silent layers, covering the evidence of the fields, covering the paths, covering the secrets that lay buried in the small town of Grayford. But inside the sheriff's office, a quiet determination took root. The fragments of paper, the faint fingerprints, the scattered witness accounts, they were beginning to coalesce, and with them, the story of Claire Benton, and the man who had stalked her final days, was starting to emerge from the cold, ready to be confronted. The days in Grayford grew shorter, the sunlight weak and pale as December settled in,
leaving the town bathed in a muted grey light that seemed to press down on the streets, the fields, and the people who lived among them. Sheriff Travers felt the weight of those days in his bones. Each morning brought new reports, new fragments of leads, yet each one seemed to vanish almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving him chasing shadows across a landscape that refused to give up its secrets easily. The focus was now entirely on Douglas Crane. His alibi remained inconsistent. While his employer insisted Crane had been on a series of long hauls, the company's records were incomplete, dotted with gaps that coincided exactly with the days surrounding Claire Benton's disappearance. The partial fingerprint found on her note had placed him in direct contact with her, and while he had offered an explanation, a vague claim of being in town briefly to drop off deliveries, it was the kind of half-truth that could not be ignored. Travers returned repeatedly to the motel room, where Crane had been staying. Every visit was a careful negotiation of procedure, observation, and human behavior. Crane was polite, almost unnervingly composed, yet there was a tremor in his hand, a flicker in his eyes when certain topics came up. Travers began recording his observations meticulously, aware that human behavior could sometimes betray more than any written confession. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Crane, under questioning, mentioned a local bar. He said he had stopped there, for a quick drink, but his memory of dates and times was hazy. The name of the bar sparked something in Travers, who immediately drove to the location, a dim wood-paneled tavern on the outskirts of town, its sign creaking in the wind. Inside, the warmth of the fire was almost oppressive after the chill of the streets, and the smell of spilled beer and fried food clung to the air. The bartender, a wiry man named Paul Kersey, remembered Crane's presence well. He came in a few times last month, Paul said. Quiet guy, kept to himself mostly, but there was a night he seemed agitated. Checked his watch a lot, kept glancing at the door. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured he was a nervous traveler. Travers pressed for more details. Did he talk to anyone? Did he mention a girl, or a woman? Paul hesitated, then shook his head. No names. But he kept scribbling in a little notebook. Looked like he was making a list or notes about people. Didn't seem like anything good. A sense of grim realization settled over Travers. The notebook could be the key to understanding Crane's mind, his patterns, his fixation on Claire. Once again, the pieces were beginning to line up, suggesting that the danger Claire had sensed was neither random nor fleeting. It had been methodical, deliberate, a series of calculated moves by someone who understood her routines, her vulnerabilities, and her trust in a community that had always seemed safe. Travers returned to the sheriff's office late that night, the snow thickening outside, muting the usual hum of the town. He placed a call to the crime lab, requesting that they obtain a warrant to search Crane's personal effects, including the notebook, his truck, and his motel room. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. With every piece of evidence secured, the fog surrounding Claire Benton's final hours began to thin. Days later, forensic technicians returned with results. The notebook contained references to multiple women, with descriptions that matched certain physical traits and routines. One entry, dated only a week before Claire's disappearance, described a young woman with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a habit of walking through the fields behind her apartment in the early morning. The language was clinical, but disturbingly intimate, cataloging movements, interactions, and even the patterns of fear he believed he observed. Claire Benton's name appeared indirectly, noted with a series of symbols and coded letters that took time to decipher, but the meaning was clear. She had been watched, followed, and ultimately chosen. Travers felt the weight of responsibility keenly, knowing that someone had monitored a young woman's life so closely, had plotted her final days with such cold precision, made the tragedy sharper, more unbearable. Yet it also meant that justice was possible. Evidence could be presented, connections could be drawn, and the truth could finally emerge from the shadows that had long hidden it. He coordinated a raid on Crane's residence with the county deputies, moving swiftly to seize anything that could further tie him to Claire Benton. In the cold grey light of early morning, the team found the notebook exactly where the bar records suggested it would be, along with digital files, photographs, and a series of maps indicating specific locations around Grayford. Each detail painted a picture of surveillance, obsession, and ultimately the planning of a crime that had left a community shaken and a young woman's life brutally cut short. Confronted with the evidence, Crane's demeanor shifted. The calm, measured exterior cracked, revealing a tension that Travers had sensed from the beginning. Crane claimed confusion, insisted that the notebook was merely a record-keeping method for his work, and that the maps were routes for deliveries, not for tracking any individual. But the details were too precise. The overlaps with Claire Benton's last days too undeniable. Witnesses, digital traces, and physical evidence created a tapestry that left little room for doubt. In the following days, the investigation expanded. Travers coordinated with state investigators, bringing in resources to comb through Crane's history, cross-reference missing person reports, and connect any other cases that might share a pattern. While Grayford was a small town, the implications of what they were uncovering reached far beyond its borders. Patterns emerged, suggesting that Claire Benton was not the first young woman to be watched in this manner, though she was the first for whom the evidence was so concrete. Meanwhile, the Benton family struggled with a mixture of grief, relief, and anger. Ellen Benton, now somewhat steadied by the prospect of justice, met with Travers regularly. "I just want to know he can't hurt anyone else," she said one afternoon, her voice firm despite the wariness etched across her face. "I want to know Claire's name is safe from him, even if she's not here." Travers reassured her, though he knew the emotional scars would take years to heal. The legal process could secure Crane, but it could not undo the pain. Yet he also understood that uncovering the truth, no matter how painful, was a form of protection, a barrier against further tragedy. Court proceedings began in the new year, with Grayford bracing itself for the trial. The town's residents, though shaken, were united in their attention, their concern, and their desire to see justice served. Testimonies, photographs, forensic reports, and witness statements formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Each piece brought the story of Claire Benton into the public eye, revealing not just the mechanics of the crime, but the humanity of the girl whose life had been stolen. Crane's defense attempted to frame the evidence as circumstantial, claiming that the partial fingerprint was coincidental, that the notebook's entries were misinterpreted, that the maps and photographs were innocuous. Travers, however, had prepared meticulously. Every inconsistency in Crane's alibi, every witness observation, every digital trace was documented, creating a chain of evidence that was both detailed and unassailable. Throughout the trial, the small town watched, some attending daily, others following reports, but all feeling the tension of a case that had gripped the community for months. The courtroom became a quiet battlefield of facts and testimony, each word deliberate, each piece of evidence weighed for its significance. And through it all, Claire Benton's presence was felt, not in absence, but in memory, in the careful reconstruction of the life she had lived, and the tragedy she had suffered. By the third week of the trial, the prosecution had introduced Crane's own statements, the notebook and photographs that traced his surveillance of Claire. The jury, attentive and visibly affected, began to understand the scope of his actions. They saw a man who had observed, catalogued, and ultimately acted upon a dangerous obsession, whose presence in Grayford had been a silent threat until it manifested in irreversible harm. Travers attended nearly every day of the proceedings. He observed the faces of the jurors, the reactions of the Benton family, and the shifting demeanor of Crane. The sheriff felt a measured satisfaction, tempered by the reality that justice, though necessary, could never fully heal the wounds inflicted. But seeing the community's attention focused on accountability, on the uncovering of truth, gave a sense of purpose to the long, often painful investigation. In quiet moments, Travers returned to the fields, walking the snow-covered landscape, where Claire had spent her final hours. The wind whispered across the barren stubble, carrying with it the memory of October and the first frost. And yet there was also a strange calm. Each step across the frozen ground was an acknowledgement that the work had moved forward, that the story had been pieced together, and that the man responsible could finally be held to account. The trial stretched on, testimony after testimony, painting a picture that was impossible to ignore. Crane's pattern of behavior, his presence in town, and the meticulous planning became undeniable. And when the jury finally retired to deliberate, Travers and the Benton family waited together, bound by grief, hope and the desire for closure that seemed almost within reach. As night fell over Grayford, the snow reflecting the muted streetlights, Travers felt the rare clarity that comes when an investigation, months in the making, begins to resolve. The shadows were longer looming over the town. The long night seemed quieter now, less oppressive, as if the mere act of justice being pursued had altered the rhythm of Grayford itself. For Sheriff Travers, there was still work to be done, paperwork to finish, evidence to log, but the endless chase that had defined the past months had reached a pivotal moment. The pieces were in place, the story had been told, and the community could finally confront the truth in a way that allowed it to breathe again, even if only slightly. The jury returned after several hours of deliberation, the courtroom thick with tension. Faces were taut with anticipation, whispers stifled as the foreperson rose to read the verdict. Travers felt a knot tighten in his stomach, not from fear of the unknown, but from the accumulation of months of meticulous investigation, of interviews conducted in the dim light of offices and living rooms, of nights spent poring over digital records, and notebooks that told a story far darker than anyone had wanted to imagine. On the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Douglas Crane, guilty as charged. The words reverberated through the courtroom. Ellen Benton's hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that were both sorrowful and cathartic. Across the room, Crane sat motionless, jaw tight, hands clenched, a man stripped of the facade he had maintained for so long. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, as though the verdict had lifted an unspoken weight that had pressed down on the town for months. Travers remained seated for a moment, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. Justice, in its slow and deliberate way, had been delivered, yet the satisfaction was tempered. The relief in the faces of the Benton family did not erase the loss, nor could it restore the ordinary rhythm of life that Claire had once taken for granted. It could only affirm that the man responsible would no longer be able to inflict harm on anyone else. Outside the courthouse, reporters and residents gathered, eager for statements, eager to witness the closure that the trial had finally brought. Travers spoke briefly to the press, careful with his words, measured yet firm. This verdict reflects the diligence of our investigative team, and the community's commitment to uncovering the truth. It is a step toward justice, but also a reminder of the fragility of safety and trust. We must remain vigilant, and we must honor the memory of Claire Benton by ensuring that our community continues to care for each other.
The Benton family declined to speak publicly beyond a short statement, their grief still too raw, their relief tempered by the knowledge that no verdict could truly undo the harm. Yet there was a subtle sense of release, a quiet affirmation that the months of uncertainty, of fear, of haunting questions had reached a conclusion that at least partially honored their daughter's life. In the following weeks, Crane was sentenced. The courtroom, now familiar with his presence, listened as the judge delivered a sentence that reflected the severity of his actions, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Crane's expression remained unreadable, a mask that no longer needed to maintain a semblance of civility. The sentence brought a finality that many in Grayford had long awaited, a definitive barrier between him and the rest of the town, a boundary that ensured his obsession could no longer manifest in real-world harm. For Travers, the resolution of the case marked a transition. There were still details to tie up, interviews to conclude, and reports to finalize, but the overwhelming weight of the hunt had dissipated. He spent time revisiting the scenes, retracing the paths Claire had taken, the streets she had walked, the fields she had crossed. There was a quiet poignancy to these visits, the snow melting in patches as winter edged towards spring, the air crisp yet hinting at renewal. Travers walked slowly, observing the subtle changes in the town, feeling the lingering presence of a young life that had left such an indelible mark. He also focused on the community. Grayford, shaken but resilient, began to engage in conversations about safety, awareness, and vigilance. Local organizations initiated programs for young adults, neighborhood watches became more structured, and schools began hosting sessions on personal safety and community responsibility. It was a collective effort, small but significant, a means of transforming grief and fear into proactive care. The Benton family, while still navigating the complex landscape of mourning, began to find moments of quiet reflection. Ellen Benton started writing in a journal, documenting memories of Claire, recalling the small details of her laughter, her favorite songs, and the little routines that had defined her daily life. Each entry was an act of preservation, a way to ensure that Claire's presence remained vivid, even as the past month's shadow receded. Travers visited them occasionally, not as a lawman, but as a witness to their ongoing process of healing. Conversations were gentle, careful, often stretching into long silences where words were unnecessary. In these moments, the sheriff observed the subtle resilience that grief could cultivate, a combination of memory, mourning, and the quiet insistence to move forward, even when the pain refused to fully dissipate. The investigation into Crane's prior history revealed patterns that deepened the understanding of his behavior. Reports of previous encounters, minor infractions, and anecdotal observations painted a picture of a man increasingly isolated, increasingly meticulous, and increasingly focused on individuals who, by circumstance or design, entered his awareness. These findings were disturbing, but they also highlighted the importance of vigilance and the critical role that attentive law enforcement and community awareness could play in preventing further harm. In the months following the conclusion of the trial, Travers reflected on the broader implications of the case. Grayford was a small town, its rhythms slow and familiar, yet it had been exposed to a depth of human behavior that many larger communities might never confront so intimately. The case of Claire Benton, while uniquely tragic, served as a stark reminder of the fragility of safety, the complexity of human behavior, and the necessity of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Winter gave way to early spring, and the fields around Grayford began to thaw, the snow receding to reveal the earth beneath. Travers often walked the edges of these fields, mindful of the long months when he had retraced footprints in the snow, scanned for signs, and pieced together a story from fragments. The land seemed to breathe again, though the memory of the events lingered, as it must, a quiet testimony to the life that had been lost and the determination that had ensured accountability. Community meetings began to incorporate discussions about the lessons learned. Law enforcement shared insights on recognizing predatory behavior. Residents spoke about the importance of neighborly vigilance, and local youth organizations emphasized the value of communication and awareness. Grayford, though scarred, was actively reshaping itself, drawing strength from the collective experience, and fostering a sense of care that had previously been implicit, but now became explicit. Travers, reflecting on the months of investigation, the trial, and the aftermath, understood that the resolution was not an end, but a transition. Claire Benton's life had been tragically cut short, but her story, once obscured, had now been told in full. The sheriff recognized that the work of remembrance, vigilance, and community support would continue indefinitely. He also recognized that this process, though painful, could transform grief into action, fear into awareness, and loss into a form of communal resilience. For the Benton family, the journey toward healing was ongoing, measured in small steps: a shared meal, a quiet conversation, a visit to the places Claire had loved. These moments, though subtle, carried immense weight. Each act of remembrance was a reaffirmation that her presence mattered, that her life, though brief, had left a tangible imprint on the people around her. As the town settled into the rhythms of spring, the snow replaced by a tentative green, Travers felt a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that Grayford had confronted one of its darkest moments with clarity and resolve. The resolution of the case, the trial, the conviction, These were not cures for the wounds, but they were milestones. They were the acknowledgement that truth had been pursued, that justice had been enacted, and that the memory of Claire Benton would be honored through vigilance, care, and remembrance. In the evenings, when the streets were empty and the wind whispered through the budding trees, Travers often found himself walking the fields alone. The silence was profound, yet not oppressive. It carried the resonance of reflection, of understanding, and of the complex interplay between grief and resolution. The town, though forever changed, could breathe again, and within that breathing was a quiet affirmation of resilience, a testament to the enduring strength of community, and a recognition of the life that had been lost but not forgotten. And so Grayford moved forward, carrying the memory of Claire Benton like a quiet flame. Her story, once fragmented, now illuminated the necessity of awareness, the importance of justice, and the enduring capacity for a community to protect, remember, and heal. Sheriff Travers, standing at the edge of the fields where her final footsteps had once been traced, understood that the cold, hard truth of human behavior had been confronted, and while the ache of loss remained, it had been transformed into purpose, vigilance, and a commitment to never allow such darkness to go unchecked again. In the early hours of October 14th, 1995, a quiet suburban street in Spokane, Washington, remained cloaked in darkness, and the occasional flicker of streetlights reflected on wet pavement. Residents were asleep, unaware that in one modest home, a life had ended far too soon. The neighborhood, known for its manicured lawns and a sense of predictable safety, would soon awaken to a reality that would unsettle the fabric of its tranquility. The victim, 12-year-old Angela Thompson, had been described by neighbors and teachers as an unusually perceptive child with a quiet intelligence that seemed beyond her years. She was known for her careful observation, her love of books, and her habit of helping others without fanfare. On that October morning, Angela's absence was first noted by her mother, who had awoken to prepare breakfast and found the house unusually silent. Calls and gentle knocks went unanswered, a growing unease replacing the typical morning routine. Angela's mother, Linda Thompson, initially thought she might have slipped outside or been delayed on the way to school. But as moments stretched into an hour, panic began to take root. The neighborhood, familiar and seemingly safe, suddenly felt alien and menacing. Linda checked every corner of the house, calling out her daughter's name until her voice cracked with anxiety. A neighbor, responding to her frantic knocks, suggested contacting the authorities immediately, recognizing that the disappearance of a child in a quiet community was a situation that required urgent attention. The Spokane Police Department received the call shortly after 8:30 a.m. Officers arrived promptly, canvassing the property and interviewing the parents. Initial impressions were of a child who had been in her room the previous evening, with no indication that she had planned to leave or that any conflict had arisen. The investigation began with methodical care, questioning neighbors, retracing the child's likely movements, and examining the home for any signs of forced entry or struggle. It quickly became clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. Within hours, a search party formed. Volunteers scoured nearby streets, alleys, and wooded areas, calling Angela's name, their voices trembling in the morning air. The community rallied around the Thompson family, bringing blankets, food, and unwavering support. Yet as the sun climbed higher, a chilling thought began to infiltrate the consciousness of all involved, the possibility that Angela had been taken by someone known to her, someone who had quietly observed her routines and vulnerabilities. Evidence found in the home suggested the presence of an outsider. A window latch was forced, small footprints were discovered near the garden, and faint fibers that did not belong to the Thompson household were collected for analysis. The meticulous nature of the crime hinted at premeditation, a disturbing awareness of how to avoid immediate detection. Detective James Carmichael, assigned to the case, noted in his report that the level of planning suggested someone familiar with the neighborhood, someone who could move unnoticed in the quiet hours before dawn. As the investigation expanded, law enforcement focused on the wider network of adults who had regular contact with Angela. Teachers, family friends, and local acquaintances were questioned in detail. Interviews revealed no apparent threats or conflicts in Angela's life, Yet a subtle tension emerged as detectives pursued leads that seemed tangential at first, but gradually coalesced into a pattern. Certain adults, initially considered peripheral, demonstrated inconsistencies in their statements. Their nervous glances, evasive answers, and inability to provide verifiable alibis raised the first shadow of suspicion. By the third day, Angela had still not been located. The local media amplified the urgency, broadcasting descriptions, photographs, and pleas for information. Communities beyond Spokane offered assistance, with organizations specializing in missing children stepping in to advise on search strategies and behavioral profiling. The sense of urgency was palpable, as every passing hour reduced the likelihood of a safe recovery. Detectives relied heavily on both traditional investigative techniques and emerging forensic methodologies, hoping that a minute detail might unlock the case. It was during the fourth day that a crucial breakthrough occurred. Fibers collected from the scene matched materials found in the home of 34-year-old Kenneth Ken Whitaker, a neighbor whose family lived just 3 houses down from the Thompsons. Whitaker, known to be a loner, had maintained a subtle presence in the neighborhood, often observing children from a distance, while offering occasional friendly gestures to adults. His record was unremarkable: no prior convictions, no documented history of violent behavior, but the forensic evidence suggested a connection that could not be ignored. Police approached Whitaker's residence cautiously, aware that confrontations could endanger Angela if she were still alive. The interior of his home revealed meticulous organization, almost clinical in its order, but also items that hinted at an unhealthy fascination with children. Officers noted notebooks containing sketches, observations of neighborhood children, and personal writings that reflected an obsession with control and secrecy. While the evidence was compelling, it was still circumstantial, and detectives knew that confirming Angela's fate would be essential to solidify their case. Neighbors watched anxiously as police activity intensified. Rumors swirled through the streets, but the facts remained contained within law enforcement circles. Whitaker was taken into custody for questioning, and detectives employed careful interrogation techniques, seeking inconsistencies and admissions without immediately revealing the depth of their evidence. The goal was to understand both motive and opportunity, to chart the sequence of events that had led to Angela's disappearance. The first hours of questioning yielded only partial information. Whitaker's demeanor was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he recounted his activities over the previous days. Yet subtle slips, a misremembered time, a hesitated response, a contradiction in location, drew attention. Detectives pressed gently, aware that the perpetrator of such a crime often relied on meticulous planning and careful deception. The line between truth and fabrication was thin, but investigators were determined to find the thread that would lead them to Angela. Meanwhile, search efforts continued in parallel, focusing on areas that Whitaker had access to. Forested sections, drainage ditches, and abandoned structures were examined with painstaking care. Volunteers and cadaver dogs were brought in, and aerial surveillance was employed to survey inaccessible areas. Time moved with agonizing slowness for those invested in the outcome, each moment stretching the limits of hope and fear. By the 5th day, forensic analysis provided additional clarity. Hair strands and trace fibers found in Whitaker's vehicle matched those of Angela, establishing a more direct link between him and the child. Investigators worked tirelessly to cross-reference all findings with witness statements, electronic records, and behavioral profiles. The convergence of evidence painted a troubling picture: a calculated abduction, facilitated by knowledge of routines and psychological manipulation. Finally, in the early evening of the 5th day, search teams located Angela in a small concealed storage area behind Whitaker's garage. She was alive, though frightened and disoriented, having endured a terrifying ordeal. Emergency responders provided immediate care, offering blankets, hydration, and gentle reassurance. The reunion with her mother was both heart-wrenching and euphoric, a profound relief after nearly a week of uncertainty. Angela's return highlighted the delicate balance between meticulous investigation, community involvement, and the unyielding persistence of law enforcement. Whitaker was formally charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and endangerment of a minor. Further examination of his home and personal effects revealed additional disturbing insights into his behavior, reinforcing the necessity of his removal from the community. Prosecutors prepared a case that would rely on forensic evidence, witness statements, and the psychological profile that had guided investigators throughout the search. As the news of Angela's rescue spread, Spokane began to heal in small increments. The neighborhood, once enveloped in fear and suspicion, now experienced a collective exhale. Community members organized support networks, counseling for children, and forums to discuss safety without instilling paralyzing fear. Angela's experience became a lens through which residents examined both vulnerability and resilience, acknowledging the fragility of security while celebrating the capacity for recovery. Detective Carmichael, reflecting on the case, noted that the investigation was not merely about locating a missing child, but about understanding the behaviors and patterns that allowed such a crime to occur. The meticulous tracking, the careful profiling, and the engagement with the community had all contributed to a positive outcome, a rare instance where tragedy was averted before permanent harm could occur. Yet the emotional and psychological ramifications would continue to ripple through the town, a reminder that trauma does not vanish simply with resolution. For Angela, the experience remained a haunting memory, tempered by the love and support of her family. Counseling sessions helped her process the fear, the isolation, and the betrayal inherent in the actions of someone she had seen as a familiar neighbor. Each small victory, a night of sleep without nightmares, a return to school routines, the ability to play outdoors without constant fear, represented incremental recovery, milestones that underscored the resilience of a young mind confronted with extraordinary trauma. By the end of the first year following her abduction, Angela had resumed a semblance of normal life. Her story, while publicly known, was treated with care by both media and community, emphasizing recovery and resilience rather than sensationalism. Whitaker's trial commenced amid intense scrutiny, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His demeanor throughout the proceedings remained eerily detached, a chilling contrast to the grief and anxiety of those he had harmed. The court would ultimately deliver a sentence that reflected both the severity of his actions and the necessity of protecting the community from further harm. Though the streets of Spokane gradually returned to their quiet routines, the events of those October days remained etched in collective memory. Residents understood the morning after Angela's rescue was punctuated by a quiet, almost fragile sense of relief, as though the town of Spokane had collectively exhaled but remained suspended in a state of vigilance. The reality of what had transpired was slow to settle in for Angela's parents, who oscillated between gratitude for her safety and a lingering disbelief that someone they had known in their neighborhood could commit such a calculated act. The days following her return were filled with interviews, medical evaluations and counseling sessions, each one a reminder of the ordeal Angela had endured and the work required to restore a sense of normalcy to her life. Angela herself remained reserved in those first hours, her small frame curled beneath blankets, eyes wide but wary. She had spent almost a week confined in a space too small to fully stand or move comfortably, and the psychological toll of that confinement was evident. The first moments of freedom were tentative. She hovered near her mother, testing the boundaries of safety in the familiar spaces of her home. Simple acts, brushing her hair, eating breakfast, walking to the garden, were initially accompanied by hesitation, as though each movement needed careful consideration before trust could be extended to her surroundings. Counselors assigned by Child Protection Services arrived within the day, trained to help children navigate the complex emotional aftermath of abduction. They observed her interactions, noting both resilience and subtle signs of trauma, the quietness, the occasional startle at unexpected noises, the reluctance to speak about certain aspects of her captivity. Angela's responses were gradual, layered with caution, and marked by the understanding that her environment could once again shift unpredictably. The professionals emphasized patience, allowing her to regain autonomy at her own pace. Meanwhile, detectives and forensic experts continued to analyze every detail of Whitaker's residence and the items he had accumulated over time. Notebooks, photographs, and personal journals provided insight into a mind meticulously organized yet disturbingly obsessive. Law enforcement examined patterns in his previous behaviors, interactions with neighbors, and personal communications to construct a comprehensive timeline of Angela's abduction. Each fragment of evidence, while methodical and cold, helped investigators understand not only what had occurred, but how Whitaker had chosen his victim and executed his plan. In court filings and interviews, law enforcement officials highlighted the subtle manipulations and premeditation evident in Whitaker's actions. The forced entry into Angela's home, the selection of a storage area designed to isolate and conceal her, and the careful timing of his movements all pointed to someone deeply calculating. Investigators emphasized the necessity of rapid response and community awareness in averting potential harm, framing the case as a lesson in vigilance and the importance of observing even small anomalies in behavior within familiar environments. The Thompsons' home, once ordinary and unremarkable, became a locus of both hope and trauma. Family routines were carefully reconstructed to provide stability, with meals, bedtime rituals, and school preparations occurring under consistent and predictable conditions. Angela's younger brother, who had been shielded from much of the fear during her disappearance, slowly re-engaged with her, cautiously bridging the gap between separation and reunion. These moments were tender and essential, helping Angela understand that while danger had been present, her family remained a constant, unchanging source of protection. Community support was a constant presence during this period. Neighbors brought meals, organized small gatherings, and offered companionship, balancing their empathy with sensitivity to Angela's needs. Local schools adapted, allowing her to return on a flexible schedule that prioritized emotional recovery over immediate academic expectations. Teachers who had known her before the abduction were attentive to subtle changes in behavior, occasional withdrawal, moments of hypervigilance, or hesitation to participate in group activities. Staff coordinated with counselors to provide a network of observation and intervention, ensuring that Angela's reintegration into normal life was gradual and nurturing. Despite the apparent relief of her safe return, the investigation into Whitaker continued to uncover disturbing details. Items in his home suggested an extensive preoccupation with children, including detailed observations, sketches, and writings documenting their routines. Law enforcement noted a deliberate effort to track patterns, reflecting a chilling awareness of surveillance and control. These findings underscored the complexity of the abduction, highlighting the necessity of both preventative measures and meticulous forensic analysis to protect children from similarly calculated threats. Angela's recovery was not solely a psychological process. Physical care was equally important. While she had been provided basic sustenance during her confinement, the irregularity of her environment left her fatigued and slightly malnourished. Doctors performed a thorough examination, addressing minor health concerns, monitoring for signs of infection, and ensuring that she regained strength. Even routine medical visits carried emotional weight, requiring gentle encouragement and patient reassurance. Each small milestone, a healthy meal, a restful night of sleep, a smile that lasted more than a fleeting moment, became a marker of progress, reinforcing the careful work of healing that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. In the wider community, the story of Angela's survival inspired both relief and reflection. Local media outlets, while reporting facts with care, highlighted her resilience and the concerted efforts of law enforcement and neighbors. Conversations emerged about child safety, the importance of awareness in seemingly secure neighborhoods, and the need to recognize subtle signs of predatory behavior. Neighborhood associations organized workshops, inviting experts to speak on vigilance, behavioral profiling, and community cooperation, ensuring that the lessons learned would extend beyond a single incident. Angela's own voice began to emerge gradually. Initially, she spoke in small guarded sentences, recounting events in fragmented pieces and avoiding descriptions that felt too frightening. Counselors worked with her to create a safe space for communication, using art, play, and guided storytelling as tools to express experiences she could not. Through drawing and narrative exercises, Angela was able to externalize her fear, frustration, and sense of betrayal. These expressions, while sometimes painful, became essential to her recovery, allowing her to reclaim agency over a story that had been violently interrupted. Interactions with Whitaker became a focal point of public discussion as court proceedings commenced. He maintained a detached demeanor throughout, seemingly unaffected by the gravity of his actions. Legal experts noted the importance of maintaining procedural integrity, despite the emotional intensity of the case, emphasizing evidence-based prosecution over sensationalized narratives. Prosecutors carefully compiled forensic findings, witness testimonies, and Angela's own accounts to present a comprehensive case that demonstrated premeditation, intent, and calculated manipulation. The legal process, though slow and exacting, became another element of Angela's recovery, a structured response to chaos, reinforcing the principle that justice required methodical attention and unwavering diligence. As the months passed, Angela began to reclaim facets of her previous life. School attendance normalized, friendships were rekindled, and hobbies that had been set aside during her abduction returned to her routine. Her mother, Linda, remained closely involved, balancing protective instincts with encouragement for independence. Each day, Angela navigated a complex terrain of healing, negotiating fear, rebuilding trust, and finding joy in activities that had once been taken for granted. Her resilience became a quiet inspiration, a testament to the capacity of a young mind to recover, when supported with patience, understanding, and consistent care. Family therapy sessions became a cornerstone of ongoing support. The Thompsons worked together to process collective trauma, understand behavioral shifts, and develop strategies to ensure Angela's continued safety. Open communication, structured routines, and shared acknowledgement of emotions created a framework for trust and security. The experience, while deeply traumatic, became an opportunity to strengthen bonds, fostering a sense of cohesion that allowed Angela to feel both seen and protected. Law enforcement continued to monitor the broader implications of the case. Whitaker's capture and conviction sent a message regarding the vigilance required to prevent child abduction, particularly in suburban settings where familiarity can obscure risk. Officers engaged with the community, offering guidance on recognizing warning signs, securing homes, and maintaining active observation, without fostering paranoia. The case became a study in the delicate balance between vigilance and everyday life, emphasizing proactive awareness, without undermining the sense of safety that neighborhoods rely upon. Angela's story, while rooted in fear and vulnerability, ultimately highlighted the strength of human connection, community solidarity, and professional diligence. Each phase of recovery, psychological, emotional, social, and physical, required attention, patience, and care. The collaboration between family, law enforcement, mental health professionals, and neighbors illustrated the multifaceted approach necessary to support a child through trauma of this magnitude. By the close of her first year post-abduction, Angela had made significant strides. Nightmares were less frequent, and she was able to spend time outdoors without excessive caution. Her mother's watchful presence, coupled with professional guidance, created an environment in which Angela could gradually re-establish her sense of agency. School reports indicated progress in both academic engagement and social reintegration. While occasional anxiety persisted, it was met with structured coping strategies, peer support, and consistent reassurance. The neighborhood, though forever altered by the experience, began to embrace healing. Community gatherings, previously disrupted by fear, resumed with a new emphasis on safety, awareness, and mutual support. Residents spoke candidly about the incident, not to sensationalize, but to acknowledge the vulnerability that had been exposed, and to commit to proactive vigilance. Angela's return became both a catalyst for collective reflection and a symbol of resilience, underscoring the profound impact that a single act of courage, compassion, and persistence can have on a community in crisis. Through all of this, Angela learned that recovery was not linear. Some days were filled with laughter and normalcy,
while others brought back memories of confinement and fear. Her journey became a testament to the complexity of trauma, the necessity of patient support, and the remarkable capacity for a young person to reclaim life, even after exposure to profound danger. With each passing month, the threads of fear, uncertainty, and distrust were carefully replaced with patterns of trust, routine and hope, forming the foundation upon which Angela could continue to build her life. Even as the court proceedings against Whitaker continued, Angela and her family focused on the present, valuing moments of safety, connection, and the months following Angela's return brought with them a slow, deliberate rhythm of recovery, marked by both small victories and inevitable setbacks. Each morning, Angela awoke to a world that, while familiar in its physical contours, had been irreversibly altered in the contours of her mind. She moved through her house with cautious optimism, aware of the safety her parents provided, but still negotiating the lingering shadows of her captivity. Her footsteps were quieter, her glances sharper, as though her body had retained a memory of surveillance and confinement that her mind was only beginning to process. School became both a sanctuary and a challenge. Teachers noted her attentiveness in class and her aptitude for quiet observation, skills perhaps sharpened during her time in confinement, but her social interactions were tentative. Friendships that had once come effortlessly now required negotiation and reassurance. She would sometimes withdraw into the edges of classrooms or linger behind peers in hallways, scanning the space with an almost instinctual vigilance. Counselors worked with Angela to develop strategies for these moments, using exercises in mindfulness and grounding techniques to help her remain present and navigate anxiety without becoming overwhelmed. Angela's parents, Linda and Robert, were acutely aware that recovery was not a matter of days or weeks, but an ongoing process. They adjusted their parenting with care, balancing protection with encouragement of independence. Linda in particular found herself constantly attuned to Angela's emotional state, reading subtle shifts in posture, tone and expression that signaled either comfort or distress. Robert took a more pragmatic approach, focusing on tangible routines, household organization, and monitoring of school and social activities. Together, they formed a united front, providing both stability and flexibility, a delicate equilibrium that allowed Angela to explore her world while feeling tethered to a consistent sense of security. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of Angela's daily life. The first sessions had been tentative, with Angela often responding to questions with single words or gestures. Over time, she learned to articulate fragments of her experience, beginning with neutral observations and gradually progressing to descriptions of her fears, frustrations, and small acts of resistance that had sustained her during confinement. Her therapist emphasized the importance of agency, helping Angela recognize that the choices she made, even under extreme duress, were evidence of her resilience. These insights became empowering, reframing what had been a period of helplessness into a narrative of strength and endurance. Angela's physical recovery also required attention. Her body had endured significant stress during captivity, with limited nutrition and prolonged immobility, leaving her fatigued and prone to muscle weakness. Doctors developed a regimen of light exercise and nutritional guidance, aiming to restore both strength and overall health. Initially, even simple stretches or walks around the yard were met with resistance, her muscles tight and her confidence fragile. Yet, each completed task became a marker of progress, and her body slowly regained its capacity to move without fear. Physical strength, Angela's parents learned, was intimately connected to her sense of autonomy, and small victories in mobility fostered small victories in confidence. The investigation into Whitaker's activities continued in parallel with Angela's recovery. Law enforcement officials discovered patterns in his behavior that were both meticulous and disturbing. Surveillance of his property, coupled with digital forensic analysis of his communications, revealed extensive planning and a fixation on children within the neighborhood. Investigators described a level of premeditation that underscored the severity of the threat he posed. Evidence collected included journals detailing daily routines, lists of potential victims, and notes on methods of control and manipulation. The case became a textbook example of organized predatory behavior, reinforcing the importance of community vigilance and proactive intervention. Whitaker's trial loomed over the family, like a shadow, a reminder that the ordeal was far from over. Angela and her parents were advised to maintain distance from media, all focusing instead on their own healing, while the legal system processed the evidence. The courtroom itself became a site of intense scrutiny, a space where Angela's story was translated into legal testimony and procedural formality. Her parents attended sessions to support her, but their presence also served as a shield, a buffer against the dehumanizing aspects of trial proceedings. Angela's own voice was carefully prepared for moments when her account would be necessary, ensuring that her testimony was coherent, truthful, and protected from unnecessary exposure to trauma. Community support persisted, taking new forms as neighbors sought to maintain a sense of normalcy, while acknowledging the fragility of post-traumatic adjustment. Local organizations organized small group activities and family-oriented events, emphasizing safe spaces where children could play and families could connect. For Angela, these gatherings were both challenging and therapeutic. She initially lingered on the margins, observing before participating, but gradually, she began to engage in supervised games, finding small joys in swings, sandbox play, and storytelling. Each instance of social interaction, no matter how modest, was a vital thread in rebuilding confidence and trust. At home, Angela's routines were carefully structured, yet flexible enough to accommodate her fluctuating emotional state. Mornings began with breakfast at the same table, followed by periods of quiet reading, homework, or art. Afternoons were often spent outdoors, supervised by one parent, allowing her to enjoy open spaces without triggering lingering anxiety. Evenings incorporated reflective activities, drawing, journaling, or gentle conversation about the day's events. These rituals provided a consistent framework, reinforcing the message that the world could be predictable, safe, and supportive, a stark contrast to the chaos of her abduction.
As Angela's comfort in her environment grew, her curiosity about the outside world began to re-emerge. She expressed interest in returning to local extracurricular activities and slowly reintegrated into school clubs and social gatherings. Each step required careful planning and support from both her family and professional counselors. Small goals were set: attending a class party, participating in a group project, walking home with a friend. Each achieved milestone, reinforcing her sense of agency. Angela's progress was incremental but steady, illustrating the interplay between patience, support, and the child's innate capacity for resilience. The psychological effects of trauma remained evident, however, in subtle ways. Angela exhibited heightened awareness of potential threats, a vigilance that sometimes manifested as hyper-focus on minor details or reluctance to separate from trusted adults. Flashbacks occurred sporadically, often triggered by environmental cues reminiscent of her captivity: locked doors, dark corners, or sudden noises. Counselors employed techniques such as grounding exercises, narrative reconstruction, and controlled exposure to familiarized triggers to help Angela process these moments safely. The work was painstaking, requiring repeated practice and reassurance, but over time, she developed coping strategies that allowed her to navigate triggers with increasing autonomy. Legal proceedings against Whitaker progressed with meticulous attention to detail. Prosecutors presented evidence of his planning and intent, relying on physical artifacts, digital footprints, and Angela's account to establish a narrative of premeditated abduction and confinement. Expert witnesses testified on behavioral patterns typical of organized offenders, reinforcing the deliberate nature of Whitaker's actions. The trial, though emotionally taxing for the family, underscored the necessity of procedural rigor in holding perpetrators accountable. Each session reminded Angela and her parents of the broader significance of their ordeal, that beyond their personal trauma, their experience could serve as a critical lesson in vigilance, justice, and communal responsibility. Angela's school life, while improving, remained a space where progress and struggle coexisted. Teachers noted her increasing participation in classroom discussions and her return to previously enjoyed subjects such as art and reading. Socially, she navigated the delicate process of reconnecting with peers, alternating between bursts of confidence and moments of retreat. Friendships, once fluid, required careful nurturing. Her peers, guided by educators and counselors, were taught to recognize signs of discomfort, respect boundaries, and provide consistent encouragement. In these interactions, Angela gradually rebuilt a sense of belonging, reclaiming the social experiences that had been interrupted by her abduction. Family dynamics, too, underwent a subtle transformation. Linda and Robert became more attuned to each other's responses to stress, trauma, and concern for Angela's well-being. Siblings negotiated the return of routines and attention, learning to accommodate both their own needs and Angela's emerging comfort zones. The home became a microcosm of recovery, a place where emotional expression was validated, boundaries were respected, and trust was reconstructed through consistency and care. These familial interactions, while ordinary in appearance, carried profound significance in reinforcing a sense of safety and stability for Angela. Despite ongoing challenges, milestones in Angela's recovery were celebrated quietly but meaningfully. She completed a full school day without anxiety-related interruptions for the first time, successfully joined a small art club, and participated in a neighborhood outing under her parents' supervision. Each accomplishment was a testament to her perseverance and the careful scaffolding of support surrounding her. For her parents, these moments were bittersweet, joyful in progress, yet reminders of the fragility of childhood and the abruptness with which it had been threatened. Whitaker's eventual conviction provided a measure of closure, though it did not erase the memories of Angela's confinement. The legal resolution affirmed the justice system's capacity to respond to calculated predation and provided a framework for the family to begin fully processing their experience. Yet, the emotional work persisted beyond the courtroom, in therapy sessions, in quiet conversations at home, and in Angela's gradual return to independent exploration of her world. Recovery, her family understood, was not a finite process but a continuum, one that required vigilance, patience, and unwavering support. Through it all, Angela demonstrated remarkable resilience. Her journey was not linear. Progress was punctuated by moments of fear, doubt, and hesitation. Yet, with consistent support from family, professionals, and community, she began to reclaim the rhythms of childhood, curiosity, playfulness, and trust. Each step forward was built upon small victories, intentional interventions, and the profound understanding that trauma, while shaping her experience, did not define the totality of her life. By the end of the year, Angela's presence in the community became both a symbol of survival and a reminder of vigilance. Her story prompted conversations about child safety, the importance of attentive parenting, and the role of community awareness in preventing abduction. Neighborhood workshops, school programs, and law enforcement outreach used her case as a reference point for education and preparedness. Yet, amidst the public lessons, Angela's personal triumph remained quietly remarkable, a young girl navigating the aftermath of profound trauma with courage, supported by a network of care that prioritized her well-being above all else. Even as Angela's life gradually resumed a sense of normalcy, she retained an acute awareness of her own strength. Each day represented both a reclamation and a reaffirmation that the ordinary routines of childhood, attending school, playing with friends, exploring the outdoors, were victories in their own right. The careful, deliberate progress she made underscored a truth central to her recovery. Resilience is forged not in a single moment of bravery, but through the accumulation of patient, steady steps forward, guided by trust, care, and a belief in the possibility of safety after trauma. The path forward, while never entirely free of shadows, became increasingly illuminated by moments of hope, joy, and reconnection. Angela's story, rooted in fear but transformed through perseverance, professional support, and familial love, reflected the complex reality of healing after abduction. It demonstrated that recovery is multifaceted, psychological, physical, social, and emotional, and that the combined efforts of a dedicated family, attentive professionals, and a supportive community can create the conditions for a young survivor not only to endure but to thrive. In those quiet evenings, when Angela sat with a sketchpad, capturing scenes from her imagination, or read softly in bed, she was in essence reclaiming her world. Each drawing, each carefully chosen word, was a testament to the return of agency and the reassertion of control over a life that had been violently interrupted. These small acts, ordinary in appearance, were profound in significance, the embodiment of survival, the reclamation of trust, and the enduring promise that childhood, though scarred, could still be vibrant and full of possibility. Even with Whitaker behind bars, Angela and her family remained vigilant, understanding that safety is a living practice, not a static state. Precautionary measures in the home, careful observation of routines, and ongoing emotional support continued to form the backbone of daily life. Yet within this structure, Angela's confidence grew, her laughter returned, and the weight of fear gradually lessened. Each day became an affirmation that life, though once violently disrupted, could be rebuilt with care, patience, and unwavering support. Recovery, in Angela's story, was not a destination but a process, a continuous negotiation between fear and courage, trauma and resilience, dependence and independence. Her journey, though deeply personal, resonated beyond the walls of her home, offering lessons about vigilance, empathy, and the extraordinary capacity of a child to reclaim agency in the aftermath of violence. Through it all, the quiet, steady rhythm of everyday life, school, family meals, walks in the neighborhood, creative pursuits, became the foundation upon which Angela Thompson could continue to grow, heal, and ultimately thrive. The shadows of Whitaker's actions would never entirely disappear, but they became tempered by the light of Angela's resilience, the steadfastness of her family, and the enduring support of a community determined to transform fear into proactive care. In the delicate balance between trauma and recovery, her story stood as a testament to the human capacity to endure, adapt, and reclaim the life that had been threatened, one steady step at a time. Angela's healing, while ongoing, reflected an essential truth. Even in the wake of deliberate cruelty, the combination of compassion, structure, and unwavering support can allow a child to emerge not only intact but strengthened, capable of finding joy, trust, and possibility once more. The journey remained long, but each day forward was a victory, a quiet, profound affirmation of resilience, hope, and the enduring capacity of the human spirit.
The vanishing of Lisa McVeigh. On a warm June afternoon in 1984, the streets of Tampa, Florida, hummed with the usual rhythm of suburban life. Children played in yards, sprinklers hissed against the hot pavement, and the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the distant aroma of barbecues. Amid this ordinary scene, a girl named Lisa McVeigh rode her bicycle home from school. She was 13 years old, with long brown hair tied in a ponytail, a smile that often lifted the corners of her lips even on the hardest days, and an energy that reflected the typical spirit of early adolescence. But on that afternoon, fate would intervene, pulling her into a nightmare that would leave an indelible mark on her life and the community around her. Lisa had been riding her usual route, the one that took her past familiar houses and the corner convenience store where she often bought candy with the small allowance her grandmother gave her. But as she pedaled, she noticed a man standing outside a beige sedan that looked slightly out of place along the quiet street. He seemed to be watching her with a keen, unnerving attention, and something about his stare set Lisa on edge. Still, she tried to brush off the uneasy feeling, chalking it up to her imagination. Teenagers often imagine threats where none exist. By the time she reached a quieter stretch near the woods, the man was closer. His approach was sudden, and before Lisa could react, he grabbed her, pulled her off her bicycle, and forced her into his car. The shock of the abduction was immediate and paralyzing, but Lisa's instincts, honed by years of listening to warnings and watching cautionary tales, kicked in. She noticed small details, the scent of cologne on the man's shirt, the jingling of keys in his pocket, the way he drove with one hand while glancing at her from the corner of his eye.
The hours that followed were terrifying and surreal. Lisa was driven to a small, dimly lit apartment where the man restrained her. He was methodical, almost clinical, in his actions, which only heightened the sense of impending danger. He was a serial offender, someone who had done this before, and he believed he had full control. But Lisa, despite her fear, was calculating. Every word she spoke, every question she asked, was a carefully measured attempt to buy herself time, to keep him talking, and to learn anything that might help her survive. One of the man's behaviors stood out immediately. He forced Lisa to recount personal details about herself, her home address, her daily routines, and the paths she took after school. It was chilling, the way he gathered information, not merely to control her, but to manipulate his perception of her. Yet Lisa, astonishingly, found a way to use this to her advantage. By providing some information while carefully withholding other critical details, she kept him engaged, creating a fragile dynamic where he felt in command while unknowingly granting her small windows of observation. During her captivity, Lisa noticed patterns in his behavior. He was meticulous about cleanliness, often wiping surfaces and adjusting objects in the room. He seemed to enjoy the control he had over his environment, but there were slips, moments when he let his guard down. Lisa's memory absorbed every detail, the placement of the furniture, the sound of the air conditioner, the number of locks on the doors. Each observation became a thread she would later use to reconstruct the scene for law enforcement, and perhaps to secure her escape. Her time in captivity was punctuated by fear and terror, but also by remarkable courage. Lisa realized that the man had weaknesses, gaps in his attention, and that he underestimated her ability to stay calm and think clearly. She noticed that he responded to questions about himself in ways that revealed more than he intended, and she memorized these pieces of information with the precision of someone preparing for survival. Then, in a rare and crucial moment, she saw an opportunity. While the man stepped out of the room, Lisa took a calculated risk. She untied herself from the restraints, recalling every detail of her earlier observations, the placement of the keys, the pattern of the locks, the path to the exit. She moved quietly, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through her body, knowing that any mistake could be fatal. Once free, she fled through the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. The world outside felt surreal, the sun brighter than it had moments before, and yet every step was measured. Lisa ran until she reached a neighbor's house, pounding on the door with desperate urgency. Her voice, filled with terror and determination, carried the weight of what had just occurred. The neighbor, a woman who had known Lisa since she was a child, quickly called the police. When officers arrived, they found Lisa shaken but remarkably composed. She recounted the details of her abduction with clarity and precision, describing the man's appearance, the vehicle, and the apartment where she had been held. Her observations were so detailed that investigators were immediately able to begin mapping his movements and behavior, laying the groundwork for what would become a case of extraordinary significance in the annals of criminal justice. Lisa's escape marked the beginning of a long and arduous investigation, one that would ultimately reveal the man behind her abduction as Bobby Joe Long, a serial killer whose crimes spanned multiple states and left a trail of devastation. But in that first moment, as Lisa clung to the officers who promised protection, it was not yet a story of serial murder. It was the story of a young girl's courage, intelligence, and resilience. The psychological impact of the experience was profound. Lisa, like many survivors of violent crime, had to navigate the aftermath, nightmares, anxiety, and the challenge of reclaiming a sense of normalcy. Yet she also became a symbol of hope and tenacity. Her detailed testimony and calm demeanor under pressure would later play a pivotal role in the prosecution of Bobby Joe Long, helping to bring justice to the countless victims he had terrorized. Even decades later, Lisa's story resonates as a testament to human resilience. It is a story of terror and courage intertwined, where the ordinary world collided with unimaginable horror, and a young girl's quick thinking and bravery changed the course of events. Tampa, Florida, and indeed the nation, would remember her not just as a victim, but as a survivor whose actions exemplified extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming fear. After Lisa had been taken to safety and the initial shock of her escape began to fade. The reality of what she had endured settled over her like a heavy, unrelenting fog. She sat quietly in the back of the police car, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out the window at the ordinary suburban streets that had just hours before been the backdrop of a terrifying abduction. The colors seemed sharper, almost unreal, the green of the trees, the blue of the sky, but Lisa's mind was occupied, not with the beauty outside, but with replaying every detail of the man who had taken her. At 13, she carried an understanding beyond her years. She knew that the man she had escaped from was dangerous in ways that most adults could scarcely comprehend. Her thoughts moved quickly from what had just happened to what could come next. Could he track her? Would he try again? She shivered at the thought, but she also clung to the awareness that she had survived, and survival gave her a quiet, steely strength. Police officers began the process of interviewing her in a way that was both professional and sensitive. They had been trained to handle child abduction cases, but even for them, Lisa's composure was striking. She recounted the abduction in vivid detail, the beige car, the man's appearance, the route he had taken, the apartment, and the methods he had used to restrain her. Every piece of information she provided was precise, almost methodical, as if she understood the gravity of each detail and its importance in the investigation. Detective Richard McCullough, the lead investigator, took special note of her ability to stay calm while describing the most terrifying moments of her life. He asked her to tell everything she could remember, emphasizing that no detail was too small. Lisa hesitated at first, unsure if anything she had noticed would matter, but soon she began speaking in careful, measured sentences. She described the man's clothes, the smell of his cologne, the color of the carpet in the apartment, the placement of the furniture, and even the manner in which he moved around the room. Each memory, though frightening to recall, became a tool in the hands of law enforcement. As the hours passed, detectives worked quickly to process the information. They cross-referenced Lisa's observations with reports of similar crimes across the state, connecting dots that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. Patterns emerged, similar abductions, descriptions of a man in his late 20s to early 30s, the use of restrained techniques and manipulation of victims. Lisa's information became crucial, not only to her own case, but to the wider effort to identify and apprehend a serial offender. Meanwhile, Lisa's family struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Her grandmother, who had been her primary caregiver, remained in a state of near-constant shock. She clung to Lisa, afraid to let go, and yet overwhelmed by the horror of imagining her granddaughter in the hands of a predator. The support of law enforcement, child protection specialists, and counseling professionals helped, but the emotional weight was enormous. The bond between Lisa and her family, however, strengthened in those moments of crisis. Their love and protection became a lifeline that allowed her to begin the slow process of healing. Despite the trauma, Lisa's mind remained extraordinarily sharp. She remembered the patterns and behaviors of her captor in ways that would prove critical later. One detail she had noticed, the jingling of his keys in a particular rhythm, helped detectives understand the sequence of his actions in the apartment. Another, the way he adjusted objects and surfaces, revealed obsessive tendencies that could narrow down suspects. Lisa's observations were not merely recollections, they were analytical tools that allowed law enforcement to construct a precise picture of the man who had tried to control her life. Over the following days, Lisa was placed under the care of professionals trained in trauma recovery. Psychologists worked to help her process the fear and anxiety that accompanied such an experience, emphasizing that the reactions she felt, nightmares, panic, difficulty concentrating, were natural responses to extreme stress. Through gentle therapy sessions, she began to regain a sense of stability, learning coping strategies to manage intrusive thoughts and flashbacks. As law enforcement pursued leads, Lisa's testimony played an increasingly pivotal role. Detectives conducted interviews with witnesses, investigated suspicious vehicles, and reviewed prior crime reports. Every description she provided, from the man's height and build to the layout of the apartment, helped them to narrow down a suspect. It was meticulous work, requiring patience and precision, but Lisa's clear recollection was an invaluable resource. Meanwhile, The broader community felt the shockwaves of the abduction. Parents spoke with a new urgency about safety, neighbors shared tips and vigilance, and the local news reported on the incident with caution and respect for Lisa's privacy. Though the community's concern was high, it was tempered by admiration for the young girl who had not only survived, but had done so with courage and intelligence. Lisa's ability to remain calm under unimaginable stress became a quiet, powerful example to all who followed her story. Detectives eventually identified a man whose past aligned with the details Lisa had provided, Bobby Joe Long. Known in law enforcement circles for his violent tendencies, Long had a history of abductions and assaults, and the description of his behavior matched the pattern Lisa had meticulously observed. Police officers quickly obtained warrants and prepared for a thorough investigation, knowing that the evidence Lisa provided could be instrumental in securing a conviction. Lisa's role did not end with providing descriptions and details. She actively participated in reconstruction exercises, revisiting locations in a controlled environment to help law enforcement understand the sequence of events. These reconstructions were emotionally taxing, forcing her to relive moments of terror, but they were also empowering. Lisa began to see her trauma as a tool for justice, understanding that her actions had the potential to prevent future crimes and protect other children. Throughout the investigation, Lisa's personal resilience became increasingly evident. She faced public attention with a quiet dignity, speaking when necessary, but refusing to let the events define her entire identity. She returned to school when she felt ready, gradually reintegrating into routines that had once been taken for granted. Teachers, friends, and family provided consistent support, recognizing that the journey to recovery was neither linear nor simple. At home, Lisa's daily life became a blend of normalcy and ongoing vigilance. She learned to navigate the world with a heightened awareness, conscious of surroundings, and careful about interactions with strangers. While this awareness could have been debilitating, it instead became a testament to her adaptability and strength. Lisa's survival was not merely a matter of chance, it was the product of keen observation, intelligence, and the courage to act decisively in moments of extreme danger. As the investigation progressed, Bobby Joe Long was arrested and brought to trial. The evidence against him, much of it rooted in Lisa's detailed accounts, was overwhelming. Long's history of predation, his methods, and the testimony of other survivors painted a chilling portrait of a serial predator. Yet it was Lisa's courage, the clarity of her memory, and the precision of her observations that became central to the case. Her testimony helped law enforcement secure a conviction, bringing justice not only for herself but for other victims whose voices might otherwise have gone unheard. Years later, reflecting on those events, Lisa described the experience not solely as a period of fear, but as a defining moment that shaped her understanding of resilience and survival. She emphasized the importance of trusting one's instincts, of observing the smallest details, and of maintaining calm under pressure. These lessons, born from a terrifying encounter, became guiding principles in her life, and a source of empowerment for other survivors she later met. Lisa's story is often recounted in law enforcement training and public awareness programs, not because it is sensational, but because it exemplifies the extraordinary capacity of a young individual to survive and influence justice. It is a story of courage interwoven with fear, intelligence interlaced with trauma, and ultimately, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure and triumph in the face of unimaginable adversity. The weeks following Lisa McVeigh's escape were both exhausting and transformative. Her days were filled with a careful routine, designed by the psychologists and social workers overseeing her recovery, but her mind remained active, alert, and often racing with memories she could not simply turn off. She learned that even though the immediate danger had passed, the work of reclaiming her sense of safety and identity was ongoing. Each morning she awoke with the awareness that the man who had taken her could no longer reach her, yet she could not forget the minutiae of his behavior, the patterns she had observed, and the terror she had endured. Lisa returned to school gradually, starting with short visits, and eventually reintegrating into full days. The hallways, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to carry shadows in corners and empty spaces. Classmates were aware of the incident, though details were scarce and carefully managed by teachers. Lisa's teachers noted her resilience. She remained polite, attentive, and remarkably composed, though there were moments when she would drift into thought, recalling some detail from that fateful day. She would sometimes sketch diagrams in her notebook, maps of streets, the layout of the apartment, positions of furniture, not as a hobby, but as a method of processing her experience, a way of retaining the control she had felt was nearly lost during her abduction. Therapy sessions continued daily, focusing not only on trauma recovery, but also on empowerment and strategy. Lisa learned that her ability to think logically, remain observant, and plan during her abduction was what had ultimately saved her life. Her therapists encouraged her to see these abilities as strengths, a mindset that slowly helped transform her experience from one of helplessness into a story of personal agency. In group sessions, she listened to other survivors, and while their experiences differed, she found solace in shared understanding. She recognized in their eyes the same mixture of fear, anger, and determination she felt in herself. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued their pursuit of Bobby Joe Long. The investigation had grown complex, with leads coming in from multiple states and connections being drawn between numerous abduction cases spanning years. Lisa's detailed recollections of Long's appearance, habits, and the precise way he had restrained her became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Detectives ran lineups, conducted surveillance, and revisited crime scenes with painstaking care, all the while consulting Lisa to confirm small but critical details. Each clarification she provided, how he carried certain items, the order in which he had moved around the apartment, subtle quirks in his speech, became instrumental in connecting evidence and ensuring accuracy. Lisa's family supported her unwaveringly, though they too were deeply affected by the events. Her grandmother, who had initially been overcome with fear and guilt, learned to channel her energy into advocacy, working with local community groups to raise awareness about child abduction and safety. Lisa's mother, though she lived in a different city, maintained daily contact, offering emotional support and helping her daughter navigate the sudden attention from media and law enforcement. The family's involvement created a protective environment in which Lisa could recover while also contributing meaningfully to the case against her captor. Despite the ongoing work of therapy and investigation, fear remained a constant undercurrent in Lisa's life. There were moments when she would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced that Long had found a way to return. Shadows in the corners of her room would take on threatening forms, and everyday noises, footsteps, doors creaking, triggered memories of her time in captivity. Yet these fears were met with techniques learned in therapy, grounding exercises, breathing methods, and logical reframing. Lisa trained herself to recognize when her mind was replaying trauma, and to gently redirect her thoughts, a skill that would later become a lifeline in moments of acute anxiety. Public attention intensified as the investigation progressed. While media coverage respected her privacy to a degree, the story of a 13-year-old girl who had survived a predator by relying on intelligence and presence of mind captured widespread attention. Experts on child safety and abduction prevention used Lisa's experience as a case study, emphasizing the importance of observation, situational awareness, and careful decision-making under duress. Lisa, however, remained remarkably private, participating only when necessary, and choosing to focus her energy on her recovery and on assisting law enforcement. As Long's previous victims came forward, the pieces of a larger, terrifying puzzle began to take shape. Each woman recounted experiences of abduction, manipulation, and confinement. While some had endured unspeakable trauma, Lisa's survival provided hope and validation. Law enforcement began to understand patterns in his behavior, his methods of control, and his signature tactics, knowledge that could potentially prevent further abductions and assist in the prosecution. Lisa's testimony was consistently highlighted as exemplary, demonstrating both courage and acute observational skills. She remembered the most minute details, the brand of detergent used in the apartment, the configuration of the kitchen cabinets,
the way he arranged his personal items, all of which became pieces of evidence that corroborated other reports. Reconstructing the abduction in controlled exercises became both physically and emotionally demanding. Lisa returned to the streets, the parking lot, and even the apartment in question, walking through her experience step by step alongside detectives. Each movement was precise: where she had been seated, how she had moved when opportunities to escape presented themselves, and how she had interacted with Long. These reconstructions were vital to understanding the timing and sequence of the abduction, and Lisa approached them with methodical focus. Though revisiting these moments brought waves of fear, she remained steady, recognizing that her clarity could directly aid in bringing a dangerous man to justice. In her own reflections, Lisa acknowledged the duality of her experience, a mixture of vulnerability and strength, terror and resourcefulness. She began to write about her experience in personal journals, not for publication, but as a means of organizing her thoughts and processing the complex emotions that therapy alone could not fully address. These writings allowed her to recognize her own resilience, and to see the thread of agency that had run through her actions, even in the darkest moments. Months passed, and Long was finally brought to trial. The prosecution meticulously laid out the evidence, much of it stemming from Lisa's recollections, which had been carefully documented and corroborated by forensic findings. His history of abductions, manipulative behavior, and prior offenses was presented alongside Lisa's precise observations. The courtroom was tense, witnesses provided harrowing accounts, yet the focus remained on ensuring the accuracy and integrity of the case. Lisa attended with her family, composed yet emotionally engaged, understanding the gravity of the proceedings and the role she played in securing justice. During her testimony, Lisa described the events with remarkable clarity. She spoke of the initial abduction, the way Long restrained her, the tactics he used to control her, and the opportunities she identified to escape. Her observations about the apartment's layout, the sounds and the sequence of actions were all precise. Lisa's courage in recounting her experience inspired not only those present in the courtroom, but also the wider public following the case. Her voice, steady and deliberate, became a central force in ensuring Long's conviction. The trial concluded with a conviction, bringing a measure of closure not only for Lisa but for other victims as well. Long was sentenced for multiple offenses, a resolution that underscored the importance of survivor testimony and the role of meticulous observation in law enforcement. Lisa's bravery, intelligence and composure had made a profound impact, demonstrating the power of resilience and the effectiveness of remaining calm under extreme pressure. In the years that followed, Lisa continued to process her experience, gradually reclaiming the normalcy that had been disrupted. She engaged in advocacy work, sharing her story with other survivors and with law enforcement professionals to educate about child safety and abduction prevention. While she remained acutely aware of the trauma she endured, she also recognized the agency and strength that had carried her through. Her story became one not of victimhood alone, but of survival, courage, and the extraordinary capacity of a young person to influence justice. Lisa's life beyond the abduction reflected a careful balance of vigilance and ordinary adolescence. She returned to school, formed friendships, and pursued interests with the determination of someone who understood both the fragility and the resilience of life. Yet even as she embraced normalcy, the experience remained a defining element of her identity, a reminder of the night she survived against the odds, and the knowledge that her own actions had made the difference between life and death. Her narrative, often cited in law enforcement training and child protection programs, emphasizes the importance of awareness, observation, and strategic thinking in dangerous situations. More than that, it stands as a testament to the human spirit, a young girl faced with unimaginable terror, who found within herself the composure, intellect and courage to escape and ensure justice. Lisa McVeigh's story continues to inspire, educate, and serve as a powerful example of survival and resilience, demonstrating that even in the face of profound danger, hope and agency can endure. The months following the trial were a mixture of relief, reflection, and subtle unease. Although Bobby Joe Long had been convicted and sentenced, the emotional aftermath of Lisa McVeigh's abduction lingered like a shadow she could not quite shake. Public attention slowly faded, leaving her with the quieter, more private challenge of rebuilding her life, while reconciling the trauma she had endured. The work of recovery, she learned, was neither linear nor predictable. It came in waves, some gentle, some unrelenting, and required patience, self-compassion and vigilance. Lisa continued her therapy, now focusing on long-term strategies for emotional stability. Her sessions became more introspective, exploring not only the events of the abduction, but also their impact on her evolving sense of self. She revisited memories of fear, helplessness, and rapid decision-making, seeking to integrate them into a coherent narrative of survival. This process, though emotionally taxing, allowed her to shift from seeing herself solely as a victim to recognizing her strength, intelligence, and resilience. Each session was a step toward reclaiming autonomy, a reclaiming of space within her own mind that had been occupied by fear for too long. At school, Lisa gradually found a rhythm that felt safe yet flexible. Teachers and classmates treated her with kindness and respect, yet she remained cautious, protective of her privacy. Despite the challenges, she excelled academically and socially, developing friendships and finding solace in routine. She became increasingly aware of the ways her experience had shaped her perception of the world. A heightened sense of observation, an attentiveness to detail, and a careful calculation of risk in everyday life. While these traits emerged from trauma, they also became tools for empowerment, reinforcing a sense of agency that had been nearly lost during her abduction. Lisa's family continued to provide unwavering support, their presence a stabilizing anchor amid the residual anxiety that persisted in quiet moments. Her grandmother remained a tireless advocate for child safety, using her own experience of fear and helplessness to educate others about abduction prevention. Her mother, though living in another city, maintained consistent communication, providing reassurance and guidance. Together, they created a network of safety and love, a cocoon in which Lisa could explore independence while feeling secure. The family's efforts underscored the importance of community in recovery, highlighting the interplay between personal resilience and external support. One aspect of recovery that Lisa embraced fully was her involvement in child safety advocacy. She began speaking, quietly at first, at local events and workshops, sharing her experience in a way that emphasized practical strategies for self-protection and situational awareness. Her insights were precise, grounded in the lived reality of her abduction, the importance of remembering details, maintaining composure, and identifying opportunities to escape. Lisa's story was both educational and empowering. It offered tangible lessons while honoring the gravity of the trauma she had endured. Each presentation reinforced her sense of purpose and reminded her that her ordeal, though harrowing, could serve a meaningful role in protecting others. Lisa's interactions with law enforcement evolved as well. She participated in training sessions for officers and investigators, offering a survivor's perspective on abduction tactics and behavior. Her meticulous recollection of Bobby Joe Long's actions and habits became a reference point in understanding predator psychology and refining investigative methods. Lisa's contributions were not just anecdotal, they were analytical and precise, providing insights into criminal patterns, manipulation techniques, and victim survival strategies. Her work helped shape a broader understanding of abduction cases, emphasizing the value of survivor expertise in both prevention and prosecution.
Despite these empowering endeavors, the psychological residue of the abduction remained. Lisa experienced occasional panic attacks, often triggered by seemingly innocuous stimuli, a sudden noise, a shadow in an unfamiliar room, or a feeling of being followed. In those moments, she relied on the coping mechanisms she had honed over months of therapy. Grounding exercises, controlled breathing, and mindful recognition of the present allowed her to navigate fear without succumbing to it. Over time, these practices became second nature, enabling her to maintain a degree of control even when confronted with intense emotional responses. As she matured, Lisa began to reflect on the broader implications of her experience. She understood that survival was not simply a matter of luck, but a combination of awareness, critical thinking, and careful observation. This understanding informed not only her advocacy, but also her personal philosophy, that knowledge and preparation could serve as armor in a world where danger, while rare, was real. She also recognized the profound courage of other survivors and victims, whose experiences, though different from her own, shared common threads of resilience and determination. This awareness fostered empathy and a commitment to supporting others in similar circumstances. Education became a central focus in Lisa's life. She pursued studies in criminal justice and psychology, seeking to understand the minds of predators and the mechanisms of trauma. Her academic work was infused with the insight of lived experience, giving her perspectives that textbooks alone could not provide. She became particularly interested in the intersection of law enforcement procedures, victim support, and preventive education. Lisa's unique position as both a survivor and a scholar allowed her to bridge gaps between theory and practice, advocating for evidence-based approaches that prioritized both safety and recovery. Lisa also worked to reclaim ordinary joys that had been disrupted by her trauma. She engaged in hobbies and social activities that reinforced a sense of normalcy and pleasure. She attended concerts, participated in sports, and explored creative outlets like writing and art. These activities, though seemingly mundane, were acts of reclamation, assertions that her life could be defined by choice rather than fear. Each small step reinforced her autonomy and gradually diminished the lingering grip of anxiety that had pervaded her early recovery. As years passed, Lisa remained acutely aware of the need to balance vigilance with freedom. She adopted safety measures in her daily life, from being mindful of her surroundings to establishing clear communication with family and friends. Yet she did not allow these precautions to dominate her existence. Instead, they became integrated into a framework of empowerment tools to navigate the world thoughtfully, without surrendering to paranoia. Her ability to operate within this balance reflected both wisdom and courage, a testament to the depth of her personal growth. Lisa's story continued to resonate beyond her immediate community. Law enforcement agencies cited her case in training programs, advocacy organizations shared her experience to educate parents and children, and media outlets referenced her courage in discussions of abduction prevention. Yet Lisa remained focused on the aspects of her life she could control: her recovery, her education, her advocacy, and the cultivation of meaningful relationships. Public recognition was secondary to her ongoing work of integrating the experience into a narrative of resilience and empowerment. In her personal life, Lisa developed a keen sense of intuition, an understanding of human behavior sharpened by both trauma and careful observation. She recognized patterns in speech, body language, and environmental cues that informed her decision-making. This attentiveness did not manifest as fear, but as a form of preparedness, a skill that allowed her to navigate complex social situations with confidence. The very traits that had aided her survival during her abduction, awareness, strategic thinking, and composure, continued to shape her interactions and choices, reinforcing the continuity between past experience and present empowerment. Through all of this, Lisa maintained a profound sense of gratitude for her life, for her family, for the support she received, and for the rare opportunity to turn trauma into action. She understood that her survival was extraordinary, a combination of instinct, intelligence, and courage. Yet she also recognized that survival was not a solitary achievement. It depended on vigilance, preparation, and the support of a network of people who believed in her and protected her. This awareness fueled her advocacy and informed her interactions with others, fostering a commitment to preventing abductions and supporting survivors in meaningful ways. Over time, Lisa McVee's story became emblematic of the possibility of triumph over trauma. She demonstrated that even in the most harrowing circumstances, an individual could exercise agency, observe critically, and make decisions that directly influenced their survival. Her narrative underscored the importance of education, awareness, and preparation in child safety, while highlighting the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Lisa's experiences offered both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration, a reminder of the dangers that exist in the world, but also of the extraordinary capacity for courage, intelligence, and survival that resides in even the youngest among us. Today, Lisa continues to share her insights, quietly but powerfully. She works with organizations dedicated to child safety, supports survivors of abduction, and remains a voice for practical strategies that can prevent future tragedies. Her life, though forever marked by trauma, has become a testament to the potential for empowerment, recovery, and impact. Through advocacy, education, and personal example, Lisa McVie demonstrates that survival is not only possible, but can also lead to meaningful action, helping to protect others and transform experience into knowledge. In reflecting on her journey, Lisa emphasizes the duality of her story, the darkness she endured and the light she reclaimed. She speaks of fear, pain, and uncertainty, but also of courage, resourcefulness, and hope. Her narrative reminds us that while trauma can leave indelible marks, it can also reveal strengths previously unrecognized. Lisa McVie's life after abduction is not defined solely by what she endured, but by how she chose to respond to transform vulnerability into agency, fear into awareness, and survival into a legacy of empowerment. Her experiences continue to resonate with law enforcement, survivors, and communities, offering a framework for understanding, prevention, and support. Lisa's careful observation, intelligence, and composure during her abduction remain instructive examples for both professionals and the public. Beyond the lessons, however, her story serves as a profound testament to resilience, the enduring capacity to reclaim life, assert agency, and transform trauma into purposeful action. Through her courage and determination, Lisa McVie has left an indelible